Chapter 686. At the end of the Sword's Year, there was indeed a second invasion by the Bloodstaff in history. The unruly corpse wizard king colluded with Count Randner to create trouble in an attempt to create an excuse to invade Elson. The deeper intention was to break away from the control of the Supreme Emperor of Madara, or at least weaken his prestige. So this was a good show directed by the Bloodstaff. It was just that some people had planned the opening of the show, but did not expect the final outcome. The Bloodstaff that once swept through the eastern region of Karsuk completely buried itself in this war. First, it was defeated by the allied forces of Ikki, Yura, and Duke Viro. Then, in the process of retreating to the Land of Spiders, it was ambushed by the army of the Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, who claimed that she was unwilling to submit to the Mercury Staff, and then died. Not long after its death, the territory it originally ruled in the Blood Forest was divided. Insursta inherited the largest part of it. Then the Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, also surrendered to the Supreme Emperor of Madara after a symbolic resistance. No matter how one looked at it, it seemed as if the corpse wizard king had dug a hole and buried himself in it. Before Insursta left Aween, he had secretly communicated with Count Randner. But in the next moment, this lovely count went to the Bloodstaff to conspire with him. Perhaps only the Bloodstaff's empty, dark, corroded mind of the corpse wizard would think that there was nothing fishy about this. The Queen of Banshees, Yalvit, was also a big suspect, but this was not something Brando was concerned about. What moved him was that he realized that this September conflict in history would bring him a huge opportunity. It might even allow him to completely solve the trouble in the southern region in one fell swoop. If his plan was successful, then Her Highness would have at least 1 to 2 years of development after unifying the southern region. Even before the Emperor of Madara was ready, if Erwin was prepared to deal with the war in advance, maybe the new Black Rose would seriously consider the route to the west. Brando was lost in thought for a moment. His finger tapped lightly on the envelope. Only he could see the opportunity in the letter. He clearly remembered this point in history. During the autumn moon of the Year of the Sword, the Bloodstaff would choose to head east from today's Buchi and enter Grinwars from the Silman region. They would then meet up with Count Randner at the border of the northern Tosunkade forest. After that, Bloodstaff's army marched north to attack Kirkle, the capital of Grinwars, in an attempt to open up a path to Viro from the west of Lake Valendon. However, the undead army was ambushed by the allied forces of Ikki, Yura, and Duke Viro near Shallow Water Town. The Bloodstaff was killed by Yalvit in the process of retreating to the Land of Spiders. The Princess and Duke Arek's army also attacked the capital of Randner's territory, Magiton. The September conflict started in the month of harvest and lasted for more than a month until the middle of the month of autumn. After that, both Madara and Erwin refused to admit that it was a war. They reached a consensus in writing that it was a border conflict where the lords privately plundered and retaliated. Brando personally participated in the war as a player at that time. Not long after that, Count Randner was expelled and fled to Madara. He joined Insursta's forces, but that was no longer something that Brando cared about. He raised his head and stared at the huge map of Erwin's southern border that was hung on one side of the wall of the castle hall in Abes. His gaze was always wandering on one of the lines. That line started from Silman in the south and reached Kirkle Castle in the north. In history, the Bloodstaff had once attacked Kirkle, but this time Brando obviously would not give the Lich so many benefits. The southern border was now in the princess's pocket, and Brando was not so generous as to give his things to others. The key was that this was the best opportunity to rope in Duke Grinwars, and Duke Viro would definitely join in. Now he could only hope that Old Man Arek would also join in the chaos. If their allied forces were completely destroyed, then the war in the southern border would in fact be over. Brando's gaze stopped at the Silman area where the war started, and he suddenly thought of some people. Those people should have gained a foothold by now. Then the plan was set. He curled his finger and lightly tapped on the table. This action made Amandina, who was at the side, tremble slightly. Amandina, who was familiar with him, knew very well that he had already decided on the next plan. As expected, Brando raised his head. He first glanced at Delphian, who was pressed down on the chair by Scarlet. This woman made him a little puzzled, but the fact that she ordered her subordinates to hurt Freya angered him even more. The Valkyrie had come to him with bandages on and told him not to be impulsive, but it was precisely because of this that Brando's heart became even colder. He pondered for a moment. A murderer should be prepared to be killed. This woman had sinister intentions. Although she did not succeed in the end, at least she had attempted to kill. Moreover, it was not her own conscience that made her stop. If Scarlet was not present at the time, Freya and even the Roman would not have been able to escape death. However, envoys were not killed in a war between two armies. Although this envoy had done some despicable things, Brando was not so petty as to argue with a woman. Besides, if he killed Delphian just like that, Freya would most likely feel guilty. He did not want to leave any grudges with the future Valkyrie because of this small matter. However, he could avoid death, but he could not escape punishment. Moreover, Brando believed that sometimes death was a kind of relief. This venomous woman was glaring at him with a face full of resentment. She was the daughter of Prime Minister Cruz, and her status seemed to be very high. If she died, there would be a real war between Erwin and Cruz. Brando stared at her. No matter how he looked at it, he felt that her deep purple eyes were filled with hatred. "My lord." Amandina seemed to have seen through his thoughts and asked in a low voice. "I don't want to see this woman for the time being. She was born with such a beautiful face, but her heart is disgustingly ugly. Take her to the water dungeon under AB's castle. I believe Lady Veronica will give me a satisfactory answer." Brando replied coldly. "Water dungeon?" Amandina asked in disbelief. She could not help but look at Delphian with some sympathy. Compared to that, perhaps it would be better to be executed directly. The dungeons under Coldwood Castle were built during Grodin's time. The water dungeons at the bottom were covered with a layer of iron cages, and the water was waist deep. It was impossible for anyone to change the water in the dungeons. There were countless corpses of humans, rats, and other creatures in there. There were also some things that she could not bring herself to mention. She could not possibly ask the prisoners to give up on excreting, right? It was hard for her to imagine what would happen to the daughter of the Prime Minister after being locked up for a few days. A woman as beautiful as her was impossible not to love beauty. Besides, Brando wanted to wait for Veronica's reply. In other words, if Veronica did not give him a reply, it was estimated that Delphian would be locked up for the rest of her life. Amandina felt her hair stand on end just thinking about it. But she could not help but sigh when she looked at Delphian. This woman only had herself to blame. When she had ordered people to hurt Freya, the entire territory had almost been stirred up. "I understand." She nodded and replied softly. Then she was ready to order the soldiers to drag the daughter of the Prime Minister away. But it was at this moment that Lorena, who was restrained to a chair by the Shire's spell, saw this scene and could not help but plead, "My lord." Although she was the one who had actually hurt Freya, she and her fiancé were treated the best. The other Cruz knight were directly tied to the ground, while she and Filas were just confined to chairs by magic. From this point, the female knight could vaguely feel that the count in front of her did not seem to be such an unreasonable person. Besides, as a knight from the army, she knew very well what kind of place the dungeon was. Delphian, who was born in a noble family, would never stay in that kind of place for more than a day. But she did not expect that as soon as she opened her mouth, Brando interrupted her and said, "Lady Lorena, I know you are an upright and kind knight. You know very well what would have happened if I had not been able to stop that scene at the time. If Freya had died, or even if she had been seriously injured, I would have immediately declared war on Cruz." He glanced at the female knight. In fact, he let Lorena and Filas sit in chairs not because he saw that they were innocent, but because Lorena and Filas were still somewhat famous in history. They were the few Cruz commanders that Brando appreciated more. The title of the upright Lorena was still circulating on the earth even after the Holy War, and he believed that she would not attack Freya for no reason. "Don't doubt my ability," he paused and continued, "Lady Lorena, I'm sure you're already well aware of my relationship with the Ash Sword Saint. If Erwin had become enemies with Cruz because of this, then what awaited the two kingdoms would have been a bloody end. Just because of this woman's selfishness, hundreds and thousands of people would have died because of it. Compared to my current indifference and ruthlessness, the Prime Minister's daughter in front of you is more like a cold-blooded executioner. Besides, when she ordered you and Mr. Filas to attack, I'm afraid she didn't consider your safety. You should be well aware of this. If you had attacked at that time, you would have been in enemy territory. If you had failed, it's not hard to imagine what kind of situation you would have faced. In fact, if you hadn't met me, I'm afraid you would have met with misfortune by now," Brando continued. Lorena was slightly stunned and could not help but fall silent. What a bandit's logic. Cruz's war with Erwin was just your own decision, my lord. But you can put it on my head and make me an executioner, my lord. Delphian was pressed into the chair and sneered. Brando looked at the woman with some pity and replied slowly, "Compared to a woman like you who has no normal human feelings, it is indeed difficult for you to understand the kinship and bonds between people. After all, these things are too complicated and profound for you. You have cold blood flowing in your veins, but I can declare war on Kurlutz for Freya's sake. That's the biggest difference between you and me. Delphian seemed to have been stabbed in the ribs. She could not help but bite her lower lip and stare at him viciously. Miss Delphian, I can endorse Count Tanagel's words and ensure that he is not an alarmist. Princess Griffine, who was watching silently from the side, suddenly interjected at this time. She replied quietly, Mr. Brando is right. This has nothing to do with reason or interest. The murderer must pay with his life. Erwin has the ability to protect its people. Brando turned his head. He looked at the princess with some gratitude. Although he knew that there was some element of buying people's hearts, at least she stood up and chose to stand with him in front of outsiders at this time. It meant that she would always be on his side in this matter. Not only Brando but even Lorena and Filas could not help but look at the eldest princess of Erwin in surprise. Both of them looked surprised and subconsciously re-evaluated the count's position in the princess's heart. It was obvious that they were more intimate than the rumors outside said. Delphian stared coldly at Princess Griffine. She trembled slightly and replied in a venomous tone, I understand. But you'd better kill me. Otherwise, I swear that as long as you don't kill me one day, I will definitely make a move on the people around you. You won't have the chance, Miss Delphian, Brando replied coldly. I know what you're thinking, but I have a lot more brains than you think. At this point he was too lazy to deal with this venomous woman anymore, so he turned back to her and said, Amandina, take her away. Everyone must be responsible for their own actions. Amandina nodded slightly, then led the accompanying soldiers to take the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Cruz Empire away. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 687. Delphian was unusually quiet as she was taken away, but she kept staring at him with eyes like a viper, which made Brando shudder a little. To be honest, if it weren't for his relationship with Veronica, he really would have put this woman to death. Anyway, a bad relationship with the Prime Minister of the Empire was inevitable, and he thought that Cruz's people might not really dare to declare war on Erwin over a woman. Lorena watched Delphian being taken away, and the female knight wanted to say something but couldn't for a moment. As an emissary of the Empire, it would naturally be disgruntled to be dealt with in this way, but the problem was that she didn't seem to have any right to be disgruntled. She thought for a long time before saying weakly, My lord, I hope you can carefully consider the way you get along with the Empire. Of course I understand, but it also depends on who it is. I naturally know the difference between friend and foe. I can only say that Lady Veronica chose the wrong person to complete the wrong mission this time. Brando replied. He gestured to the Shire, and Lorena and Filas, who were imprisoned in their chairs by magic, suddenly felt their bodies loosen. The female knight was still able to maintain her composure. But her fiancé couldn't help but let out a long sigh immediately, staring at Brando with a little fear. He had suffered a lot at the hands of the Prime Minister's daughter along the way because of his glib tongue, but he didn't expect such a terrifying woman to be locked up in the dark prison by this inhumane guy. He thought for a moment, and if it were him he would certainly be reluctant to do so. Delphian's beauty was famous throughout the Empire. Thinking of this, Filas couldn't help but look at Brando with some fear again. In his eyes, he had already decided that the other party was probably one of those legendary barbarians in the wilderness. No, he should be called a chieftain. No matter how beautiful a woman was, she was meaningless to such a boor, and in some knight novels, it was even mentioned that these barbarians seemed to prefer men. The young knight's thoughts diverged to this extent, and he couldn't help but take another look at the Shire, who had been controlling him and Lorena with magic, with a thoughtful look on his face. Of course, Brando didn't know that some strange thoughts were running through the mind of the famous idiot and almost unbelievably lucky gigolo in history in front of him. This title wasn't given to him, but the real title of Cruz's #1 lucky knight in history. First of all, he defeated many outstanding children from various noble families in Cruz, and married Lorena, Cruz's future's most talented beauty. Lorena's future achievements in Cruz could even stand shoulder to shoulder with Freya's and Erwin, and because she had a higher starting point, her achievements far beyond that of Lorena's. If he remembered correctly, Lorena and Vahina later succeeded to the position of Azure Sky's Legion commander. This was enough to surprise people, but Filas's luck was more than that. Unlike all the other noble children who grew up in intrigue, this guy's process of inheriting the title could be said to be smooth sailing. As the only son of Prince Barano, there were no competitors and even the lack of pressure from the collateral branches. Such a twisty road to the title could be said to be enough to make everyone around him green with envy. Later, our Mr. Knight participated in the Holy War at the call of His Majesty the Emperor, and then miraculously spent a considerable period of time in the front line of a hail of bullets without any war on the Eastern Front. After that, he inexplicably ushered in a series of incredible victories, and finally, his accumulated military achievements allowed him to ascend to the throne of the Imperial Legion Commander. He was known as the Legion Commander who was picked up. Later, as time passed, Mr. Philas had long been in power, and his story had long become the most legendary story among the bards. Now, the legendary couple in this legendary story was sitting in front of him. They, Lorena, was just a small knight captain under Veronica, and Philas was still an idle playboy. The journey of the two had not even begun, and he was more like a legendary figure in front of them. At least after the Battle of Ampere Seal, Brando's reputation in Cruz was not limited to just being a sword saint. Brando looked at the two people carefully. After a while, he picked up the envelope on the table again, glanced at it, and asked the female knight, "Lady Lorena, may I ask, when did the people of Cruz become aware of this?" Lorena looked at him, slightly startled, and realized what he was asking. She frowned and replied with a businesslike expression, 2 months ago, my lord." This question and answer was actually talking about the second matter mentioned in Veronica's letter to him. Compared to the first matter, which was neither painful nor itchy, the second matter was much trickier in Brando's opinion. Things had to start with the Battle of Ampere Seal. In that battle, Erwin's people finally shattered the 3 doors of flame and sent the demons back to their hometown under the Sulphur River. Of course, Brando also experienced this part of the story himself. The demon army was defeated and fled in all directions, and then completely dispersed by the Silver Elves and the Highland Knight, as well as the craftsman mages who arrived later. But there was still a small number of them who survived and escaped into the wilderness of Erwin. This small number caused a huge problem for the people of Cruz. Originally, the whole thing should have come to an end after Cruz's people were forced to completely retreat from the port of Ampere Seal for the sake of saving face. But perhaps no one would have thought that history would develop like this. About the month of the first lunar month, the monks from the Holy Cathedral of Fire found that the 3 doors of flame were missing to varying degrees after thoroughly cleaning up the battlefield. These missing doors of flame were quickly sent back to Cruz for the high-ranking priests to identify. Only half a month later, the news that the entire Holy Cathedral of Fire was shrouded in a nightmare was confirmed. The missing parts of the 3 doors of flame were almost enough to form a new portal. So it was obvious. In other words, there was at least 1 or more groups of demons, cave dwellers, cultists, or something similar from the underground of Georgandy Ridge with these fragments and were preparing to do something bad in Erwin's territory. For the Holy Cathedral of Fire, this was simply a ridiculous joke. Or rather, it was a resounding slap to the face of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Even Brando couldn't help but be a little dumbfounded when he saw the news, let alone the others. Although it was an almost open secret that the Holy Cathedral of Fire was infiltrated by All for One, he didn't expect the other party to be so useless. It was no wonder that the power core of the Cruz Empire was leaning more and more towards the royal power day by day. In the face of such a useless enemy, it was difficult for Her Majesty the Silver Queen to not win. Brando thought silently for a moment, then shook the letter in his hand. Now he was almost certain that Veronica must be having trouble sleeping and eating at the moment. If possible, he was afraid that the army commander would rather not send this letter to him. The Cruz Empire had never been so humiliated in a century, and it was continuous humiliation. But the problem was that there was now a group of people who were wandering around with these fragments of the portal, and could find an energy core to rebuild the portal at any time. Veronica couldn't turn a blind eye to it. This was actually not a serious problem for Erwin. After all, if they could get rid of 3 portals, they could naturally get rid of an incomplete temporary portal. But it was a big problem for the Holy Cathedral of Fire, no matter when or where the portal was built by these cultists. Even if it was built in a random pigsty in Erwin's countryside, the Holy Cathedral of Fire would not be able to raise its head in front of the other major holy cathedrals for at least half a century. As for the Holy War, it might be better to just hang up the truce sign and hand over the benefits in their hands. Besides, the problem of face was secondary. Such an incident would be the biggest blow to the reputation of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and would inevitably cause many people's faith to waver. Brando never thought that the largest number of farmers and craftsmen among the believers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire would have strong faith, and once faith collapsed, it was difficult to rebuild. But this was not the biggest disaster. For the people of Cruz, the worst possibility was that these cultists would bring the fragments of the portal back to the Cruz Empire. For the sake of Martha, Just imagining that scene would probably give the higher-ups of the Holy Cathedral of Fire nightmares at night. Not to mention that the demons would study and replicate these fragments. Although this possibility was very small, once it was successful, the higher-ups of the Holy Cathedral of Fire would probably have to atone for their sins with death. If it were not such a serious situation, perhaps the arrogant green sword saint would not have hoped that he would prioritize protecting the Holy Cathedral of Fire. To be honest, as a person of Erewhon, Brando was happy to see Cruz lose face, but Veronica's words actually meant that she hoped that he would help out on account of their past friendship. If one were to say who had the most real power in the southern part of Erewhon, it would naturally be him and Her Royal Highness, who had the support of the Highland Knight, Duke Anthony and the Southern Legion. That was why this letter was sent to him and Princess Griffine. Thinking of Veronica, Brando could not help but sigh. To be honest, the female commander of the Cruz Empire had left a good impression on him. Besides, there was also Vahina, and he knew that in private the arrogant young lady actually regarded him as a friend. After you found out, the Azure Skies Legion immediately entered Erewhon? He thought for a moment and asked again. No, in fact it was a big shot of the Holy Cathedral of Fire who asked Lady Veronica for help. I don't know exactly who it was. Because this matter is so important, not many people even within the Empire know about it. Lorena replied. Brando could not help but shake his head. You also know that it is important, but the person who was sent as an envoy seems to be a bit lacking in consideration. The female knight was slightly startled and immediately showed a look of hesitation. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 688. What's the matter? Brando saw her expression. If you have something to say, you might as well say it, Miss Knight. I've heard of your reputation, so I won't equate you with someone else. Miss Delphian volunteered to go, and Lady Veronica didn't know about what happened between her and you. I only noticed it later by accident. I just didn't expect her to be so resolute. In fact, it's all my fault. I shouldn't have taken any chances with such an important matter. Lorena sighed and replied with a little self-blame. Brando was suddenly curious. How so? You know what's going on? He couldn't help but be curious. Anyone who was targeted by a crazy woman for no reason would feel creeped out. In fact, he still felt very uncomfortable when he thought of Delphian's resentful eyes. It felt as if he had done something unforgivable to her, but for Marcia's sake, there was nothing between him and her. Brando remembered clearly that he had only met her from afar when he was at the front line against the calamity of wolves in the Black Forest. Actually, it's like this. Lorena was also a little embarrassed when it came to this matter. She sorted out her thoughts and then told him about Delphian in detail. Although Viscount Elman died at the hands of Andesha, Miss Delphian has always thought that you deliberately left them behind. Plus, she has always been in love with Viscount Elman, which is well known in the Empire. The Viscount's death was a great blow to Miss Delphian? This is really an unexpected disaster, Lady Lorena. Brando smiled bitterly. After listening to this ridiculous story, he suddenly felt a little speechless. This was a disaster from the heavens. If he had known that he would offend such a paranoid lady, he would have carefully sent Viscount Elman out of the country. He would never have given Andesha a chance to take advantage of him. I'm sorry, my lord. Miss Delphian, Lorena seemed to want a further plead for the Prime Minister's daughter. But Brando interrupted her first. I understand what you mean, Ms. Lorena. But even so, she shouldn't have attacked innocent people. This isn't revenge, it's just venting her anger. He thought for a moment and added, I will consider your words, but not now. It's better to let that young lady calm down. You don't want her to ruin Lady Veronica's plan, do you? Lorena was startled, and then it occurred to her that this was indeed a possibility. According to Delphian's current mentality, as long as she could get revenge, she wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice the Empire. After thinking for a moment, she couldn't help but sigh. I understand. Then let's continue. Brando replied, since not many people in the Empire know about your operation this time, then there shouldn't be many people from Azure Skies, right? May I know how many people you have? I'm sorry, this is confidential, Count. Lorena was a little embarrassed, but she still refused Brando's question. It's okay, I was just asking casually. Brando narrowed his eyes. In fact, he could already be sure that the Azure Skies that sneaked into Erewhon might only be a small elite group. As mentioned in the information he received, it might be an elite knight regiment under the Azure Skies. But there was no need to delve into this matter. He asked again, the letter says that the Holy Cathedral of Fire suspects that the fragments may be with Grand Duke Arek. Is this true? The female knight nodded and said, "Yes, since entering Erewhon, Lady Veronica has received information that matches this speculation. Maybe it was Grand Duke Erek who colluded with the cultists and demons to steal the fragments of the portal that day. I heard that Grand Duke Erek and Count Randner have recently formed an alliance, which means that this batch of fragments may have been transported to Magedon." "It's possible." Lorena frowned. "But the news from the Holy Cathedral of Fire indicates that the fragments may not have stayed in Magedon, but moved north. Do you have a way to track the location of those fragments?" Brando was stunned. He looked back at the female knight, thinking that these cruise people weren't here to make fun of him. If they had the ability to locate those fragments, why would they need him? But Lorena's answer immediately answered the question in his heart. "No, it's just some trivial divination and prophecies, my lord." Brando then realized, "Then north, where north?" he suddenly asked. "This." The female knight was speechless. How could she know such a thing? But her naturally serious personality still made her reply, "I'm sorry, I don't know either." But she didn't expect Brando to interrupt her and say, "It's okay, maybe I know." He looked back and his eyes fell on the point marked with the name Magedon on the huge map. From here to the north, it was the vast misty forest and further north into Lantern Island. His eyes moved up quickly, the Ansara Forest, the Goldfinch Mountains, the mountains on the north shore of Lake Valendon. A bolt of lightning flashed through his mind as if bringing with it a fire seed called wisdom. He suddenly raised his head and realized what these demons or cultists or Grand Duke Erek wanted to do. To rebuild a portal, first of all, a lot of magic power must be needed, preferably an energy core. The cruise people had fire gems. Then what about Grand Duke Erek? Brando's gaze finally stopped. There, on the map, was a line of fine text marked in rough font, Falling Needle Hills Avenue. Falling Needle Hills Avenue, Stained Frost Forest Maze, Heart of the Dragon. Your Highness. As soon as Brando walked out of the hall, he found Princess Griffin standing outside the porch. The half-elf girl stood by the stone window, looking out at the hills in the direction of the Gars River beach. After a moment of surprise, he immediately bowed his head and saluted. The princess turned around. She seemed to have been waiting for him here for a long time. After looking at him quietly, she asked slowly, "Your Excellency, how should we deal with the relationship with the Kurlutzians next? Are we going to help them this time?" "This time we must help, Your Highness," Brando answered truthfully. "Huh." Princess Griffin looked back with a little surprise. "What? I remember you don't like them very much?" "Actually, I already have some ideas." Falern followed Brando out of the hall and let Brando take the coat and cloak from her. Brando looked out of the window. The undulating ridge line was covered by a green forest, and above it were snow-like clouds and blue skyline. He looked at the flock of migratory birds flying away and said, "Now is a good opportunity to persuade Grand Duke Viro to join our side. If we're lucky," he added, "we might be able to get Grimoires to join us." Griffin was not stupid. On the contrary, her wisdom was one of the best among the royal family members of Erewhon's generation. Of course, she could understand Brando's meaning, but the girl looked at the cloak in Brando's hand and asked curiously, "Your Highness, where are you going?" In her memory, although the young man in front of her had become a count, he had never cared about his appearance. If he was not going out, he would rarely wear a coat, let alone a cloak or shawl. Therefore, she was keenly aware of this from Brando's subtle movements. Brando did not intend to hide it. He nodded and said, "I suddenly have an idea." "An idea?" "Yes," Brando replied. "It seems that Lady Martha is still on our side this time. If all goes well, Princess Magadol will be able to wake up." Princess Griffin was stunned for a moment, then her silver eyes revealed a look of extreme joy. She did not even bother to maintain her composure as she blurted out, "Really? When have I ever lied to you, Your Highness?" Brando was also very happy, as if the problems that had been troubling him for the past few days were all solved in an instant. He had to admit that Duke Erek and Count Randner had given him a big gift this time. In fact, he had already discussed it with Bosley and Amandina. To wake Magadol up was easy but also difficult. The nun princess was not human. Her injuries were in fact caused by the destruction of the mana source that drove and maintained her body functions. Alas herself had also indirectly confirmed this. To restore the mana source, the easiest way was to replace it with a new one. There was only one person in the territory who had mastered this technique. Brando had not forgotten that Alas had put the Titan's core into his body. However, finding a new mana core was a problem. But Duke Erek's current movements immediately gave him an answer. Because he had been busy participating in and planning Erewhon's civil war, He had almost forgotten that he was once a player. The Falling Needle Hills main path, the Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth instance dungeon, just so happened to have the most suitable mana source. The Heart of the Dragon. Duke Arek obviously went there for this thing, although Brando did not know how this guy knew about the existence of the Heart of the Dragon. But what he had to do now was obviously to find this treasure before the other party. Also, if those idiots really did build a portal there, he would not hesitate to destroy it. This way, not only would he be able to complete Veronica's mission, but he would also be able to clear up a lot of things here. For Brando, there was nothing more practical than this gift. Seeing the confident look on his face, Princess Griffin took a light breath and asked cautiously, "Are you going now?" "No," Brando shook his head. "Before that, I have to take care of something first." "What is it?" Brando grinned and replied, "Private matter? P.S. Today's third watch is 10,000. In addition, I strongly recommend the novel by the Roaring Lord Wind and Moon, Heaven's Drive. The book number is 024932250. The unscrupulous introduction is as follows. This book has all kinds of cute points that are enough to attract you. Original introduction. Who knows how many people's bones have to be stepped on to reach the peak of this world? Well, this is actually a story of a young man leading his sister and Lolita on the road of Magneto, leading the vast number of ability users to become rich and prosperous, and to a better future. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 690. Brando, where are we going? The metal parts on the two warhorses rattled as they moved through the forest one after the other. The female knight on the horse held the reins tightly with one hand and turned her head to look at the surrounding scenery worriedly. The still forest was like an oil painting, with refreshing greenery seeping out from the depths of the background. Sunlight passed through the canopy and scattered on the withered leaves like a curtain of light. The forest was silent, except for the rustling of the horse's hooves on the withered leaves and the sound of metal colliding, which made one's hair stand on end. Freya's face was a little pale. Although she had only suffered minor injuries at the hands of Lorena and was fine after Muriel's treatment. But the long journey on horseback after losing blood was still a little too much for her. Tired? Brando looked back at her and asked with concern. No, but it's getting dark. If we go any further, we won't be able to return to Schaflund. Freya said with a worried tone. She didn't know why Brando suddenly asked her to go to Schaflund and go deep into Mount Greyhar. A little further ahead was the Black Forest. It's okay, Brando smiled on horseback and didn't seem to care. When it gets dark, we can camp in the wild. With me here, what are you worried about? But Freya's face turned red. But we only have one tent. Brando liked the future Valkyrie like this, so he wasn't in a hurry to answer. When the latter glared at him fiercely, he laughed. Actually, I was lying to you. We'll be there soon. Freya breathed a sigh of relief and then realized that she had been teased. She took a deep breath and resisted the urge to punch the smirking face with difficulty. But she saw that the latter had already tightened the reins and let out a soft sigh, and the warhorse under him stopped. Brando looked around carefully as if to confirm something. Then, he dismounted from the horse with a whoosh. With one hand on the hilt of his sword, he dragged his cloak and slowly walked forward. Seeing Brando like this, Freya had no choice but to put away her original angry expression and became curious. She saw him rustling the dead leaves as he walked to a tree. Of course, she did not recognize the scientific names of the trees on the labels in the thick literature of scholars. However, she knew that the giant trees with dark trunks were commonly known as ghost trees in Erewhon. Brando, what are you looking at? Brando raised his head and looked at the ebony tree. He was very familiar with these trees, as if he had seen them again after many years of separation. There was a faint sense of intimacy. He thought of something in silence, of all the past, some of which he could not remember clearly, but the memory still flashed through his mind like shards of glittering fragments, like seashells in a sea of sand. Then he looked away and found the grayish-white boulder not far from where he remembered. The boulder was like a giant egg stuck in the ground at an angle. His eyes followed the uneven surface of the boulder, and he stopped every time he went up. After the third time he saw the forked star-shaped crack. Then he replied, "Nothing. We're here, Freya." "We're here?" Freya could not help but raise her head and look around. After half of the afternoon, the light in the forest grew dimmer and dimmer. She could only see an empty space made up of dark green treetops, twisted tree trunks and intertwined roots. From this angle, the forest looked more like a semi-enclosed cave with intersecting tunnels leading in all directions. Unlike the other places in Tanajul, The black coniferous forests that were commonly seen in Grenoires and Randner Mountains were rarely seen. Instead, it was covered with large patches of evergreen broad-leaved forests, as if there was a mysterious magic that nourished this ancient forest underground. What is this place? This should be the border of the Black Forest in this direction. Brando took a few steps forward and pushed aside a large patch of shrubs. He noticed that they were almost at the top of the mountain. Looking to the east, there were black ridges that went from south to north, like the backs of several dragons. He stretched out his hand and pointed in that direction and said, "To the east is the Eversong Forest. You should have heard of it, right?" "The mountains of Chablis?" Freya asked curiously. The mountains of Chablis were a famous landmark in the southern part of Erewhon. The beautiful scenery of the Eversong Forest had always been a tourist destination, so she had heard of it even when she was in Bucci. "Yes," Brando nodded, "but to be more precise, it should be the border between Tosancade Forest and the Eversong Forest. The Tusk Fortress is located in that direction, and it's the southern border of Erewhon." After saying that, he stared in that direction without saying a word. Surrounded by clouds and mist was a vast wilderness. The dark forest was scattered all over the place, and it was a rare sight for explorers. Any player who saw such a scene would be filled with ambition, just like a sailor trying to conquer the magnificent sea. "But why did we come here?" "Boo Brando, what are you doing?" The Night Maiden was puzzled. She did not understand why Brando would bring her to such a desolate place. But when she saw Brando taking off his cloak and coat, she was startled. She subconsciously placed her hand on the hilt of her sword and stared at him nervously. Brando stopped and looked at the future goddess of war in confusion. "What are you thinking about? Why are you taking off your clothes?" "Of course I'm going to climb down from here. What are you thinking?" Brando replied snappily, "Am I not worthy of your trust? Come and help me get my clothes. Wait here for me, idiot." Freya's face turned as red as blood. She lowered her head as if she wanted to find a hole to hide in. But when she heard Brando's request, the goddess of war dilly-dallied for a long time before she unbuckled all kinds of leather buckles and climbed down from the horse. If she dismounted at this speed in the academy, she would probably get a negative score in the riding test. Then she took the coat from Brando with trembling hands. Where are you going?" She held the coat in a daze and asked gingerly like a clumsy maid. "You'll know later," Brando replied. Then she looked up and saw him walking to the side. He pulled out a rope from the bag on the horse and tied it to the ghost tree from before. She saw him let go of the rope little by little and slowly walk to the edge of the cliff. Then he looked down and threw the other half of the rope down. "Brando, what's down there?" The goddess of war was slightly stunned and finally realized what Brando was going to do. Brando raised his head and looked at her from that direction. He put a finger to his lips and shook his head at the girl from the countryside of Bucci. Then he grabbed the rope with one hand and suddenly jumped down. "Be careful." Freya could not help but shout in a low voice. But the shouts seemed to be dragged further and further away from his ears. The biting cold wind above the cliff made him squint his eyes, and when he finally managed to distinguish the scenery in front of him, he felt that the fog below the cliff was very close to him, just like the illusion of being close to the surface of the water when he jumped into the water. Then with a whoosh he felt himself falling into the clouds. Brando hurriedly grabbed some ropes. With his strength as a gold ranker, he naturally did not need to climb down the rope bit by bit. But the last time he came here was at least 10 years ago, and nearly 100 years had passed in the game. He was afraid that he remembered the wrong location, so he brought the rope for insurance. After all, before he really activated his elemental activation, he could not fly in the sky. Brando stared at the cliff. In just a few seconds, a platform protruding out of the bushes swept past his sight. His reaction was quick. He clenched his fist, and the rope in his hand immediately tightened with a bang. The strong reaction force pulled him back and forth in the air. There was a burnt smell on the rope, but he did not feel anything strange in his hand. The physical fitness of a gold ranker had long exceeded the range of what a normal person could imagine. He raised his head and looked up. The location of the platform was not much different from what he remembered. It was more than 10 meters away from him. But this distance was almost non-existent to him. Brando gently swung the rope close to the cliff, then grabbed the jagged rocks and climbed up lightly like a monkey. The platform covered with bushes was almost exactly the same as what he remembered. Brando looked around. The rock that protruded from the mountainside was about half the size of a basketball court. But in fact it was much wider, but the dense trees and vines blocked most of his sight. He carefully walked in a direction according to his memory, then pulled away the thick entangled vines. With a crash, accompanied by the sound of soil rolling down, Brando did not use much strength to pull away the dead branches and rotten leaves. Sure enough, a cone-shaped stone slab was revealed below. This stone slab was about his height and 2 people wide. It was a bit like the stone statue of wisdom, one that was commonly seen in forests everywhere, but it was not the image of Misokai, the weaver of magic and storm, but a black moon. The silent moon, Erwin's 7th moon. This moonless moon could never be observed from the sky, but it really existed in history. Brando did not say a word. He cleaned up the vines on the platform one by one, and then revealed another 11 similar stone tablets below. On each stone tablet, there was a moon, which in turn represented the flowing fate and the source of magic in Erwin's sky. This place was the Temple of Fate. Or rather, it was where the players called it the Class Change Center. Brando had once checked the information. These stone tablets were built by a race even older than the Myernas. The purpose of their construction seemed to be to stabilize the original Martha's Law of Tiamat. In the whole of Wond, such stone tablets existed in many places, but they were all built in extremely hidden places. For example, the one in Tanajul was built on the border of the Black Forest in Mount Greyhar and had been buried for countless years. However, when Brando went to these places in the game, these stone tablets had already been cleaned up by the players in front of him, so he did not have to waste so much time on them like today. He carefully looked at the thin veins on the ground in the center of the stone tablet array, then raised his head, and his gaze followed them to the center of the platform. These rune lines and veins with a metallic glow were very familiar to him. They were very similar to the energy transmission magic circles he saw under Valhalla, as if they were made by the same civilization. This doubt flashed through Brando's mind. Then he put away his thoughts and walked to the center of the platform. Although these stone tablets in Wond contained all kinds of secrets, they only had one function in the game. That was to let the players receive their own elemental activation missions. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Although Brando had a lot of friends in his previous life, he didn't join any large guilds before the fall of Erwin. It was nothing more than a small group with a few seniors. A team like theirs naturally had no fate with a legendary dungeon like the Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth, but even so, they still experienced the perverted nature of this dungeon in the periphery. In his memory, it was when the dungeon was first opened. All the players of Erwin went to experience it, and their team was no exception. However, just like most players, a party like theirs had bumped into a huge obstacle before they even entered the dungeon. That was the baby dragon. The door god with the bloodline of the Golden Folk. Because it liked the cold climate, it entrenched itself near the Stained Frost Forest and blocked all players who tried to enter the forest. To be honest, it was difficult for the average player to imagine the power of the Dragon Clan before that. And the game designer gave all players a chance to accumulate experience in this event. The so-called baby dragon. In fact, Brando also understood that Allah's was a ready-made example. Let the players of that era, or even most of the players who had not yet elemental activation, have to face a little female dragon, the consequences could be imagined. Brando didn't even want to recall the details of the battle because there were no details to speak of. To put it simply, we came, we saw, and we fell. And this was just the old man guarding the door. Because of this, Brando urgently needed to activate his elemental activation first. Although the legendary dungeon represented the peak of team dungeon difficulty in an era, it had its limitations after all. Once the elemental activation was completed, the difficulty of the dungeon would naturally decrease geometrically. After all, it was a dungeon before elemental activation, and the design idea also had its limitations. While thinking about these trivial things, Brando walked to the center of the stone tablet array. In theory, once a player in the game walked to the center of the stone array, the quest system would immediately activate. Just like when he was in the Eternal Song Forest and the Forbidden Orchard, he immediately received a system prompt. But what made Brando slightly startled was that he waited for a little while. Except for the whistling wind in the mountains, the surroundings were silent. What's going on? Brando's heart began to panic. In theory, he had already touched the elemental wall. If he was an indigenous person, he should have already activated his elemental activation without even needing a quest. Because for the indigenous people, elemental activation was almost synonymous with elemental activation, and the rest was just the accumulation of attributes and experience. But to say that his attributes should have already been enough or even exceeded it, and his experience had already been locked. This should be a sign of preparing to unlock the elemental activation quest in any way. But the problem was, he had never heard of a player who could not receive a quest in the stone array after meeting all the conditions. Moreover, there was no second way to obtain the elemental activation quest in the game. The cold wind in the mountains blew, and in just a moment Brando's forehead was already covered in cold sweat. Many possibilities flashed through his mind for a moment, the most terrifying of which was undoubtedly that as a transmigrator, he might not be able to activate his elemental activation at all. At the thought of this, even with Brando's current psychological quality, he could not help but turn a little pale. If he could not activate his elemental activation and continue to level up, his dream of saving this kingdom and setting history on a different path would be nothing more than a bubble. In this world, no matter the situation, strength was first and foremost. But he closed his eyes and took a gentle breath to calm himself down. Although this possibility could not be ruled out, it seemed unlikely. Because if a soul from another world was incompatible with the laws of this world, then he might not have been able to come into contact with any elemental power before. But he already had a part of the elemental power, didn't he? Brando stood there blankly for a moment, then suddenly remembered something. He hurriedly opened his character panel, but all the attributes on the character panel were the same. He frowned and flipped through the pages. Suddenly, his eyes lit up slightly. His gaze stopped on the character log. At the bottom of the log, there was a line of small green text. Authority unlocking conditions not met. Authority unlocking conditions not met? Brando saw this line of text and froze for a moment. What kind of hint was this? Authority unlocking conditions not met? He knew very well that all his conditions should have met the criteria for elemental activation. There was no way that the unlocking conditions were not met. What the hell is going on? Brando couldn't help but frown. Could this be the legendary bug? However, this question seemed a bit ridiculous. Not to mention that the chances of encountering a bug in the Amber Sword were almost lower than being struck by lightning. And even if he encountered a bug now, where would he go to find the game manager to solve the problem? Brando couldn't help but feel a headache when he thought of this problem. He couldn't help but knock on his head and began to calculate the differences between himself and the average player. The biggest difference was nothing more than two. One was his own elite template, and the other was the Planeswalker system. But the elite template also existed in the game, and it didn't seem to have much to do with the elemental power and the laws themselves. He first ruled out this possibility, but the remaining Planeswalker system gave him a headache. To be honest, although the Planeswalker system had always been his biggest reliance, he had never figured out the thing itself. How did it come about? Did it also exist in the game? What was the principle of its operation? Brando only learned a few words of information from Tumen, the Stag Banshee, and Saint Tassol. Although part of this information explained the history and origin of the Planeswalker, to be honest, the three of them probably didn't know where the Planeswalker came from. Not to mention figuring out the principle of its existence. He thought for a while but couldn't figure it out. But when he thought of the name Saint Tassol, he finally remembered that there was another existence in his body that knew about the Planeswalker just like him. He hurriedly called out in his heart, "Lord Saint Tassol." Woo-woo-woo-woo? A confused voice was heard. The voice seemed to hesitate for a moment, then suddenly became clear. "Brando? Didn't I say I need to catch up on sleep at this time every day?" There was a hint of sternness in the voice. Brando hurriedly coughed. The legendary Great Sage was not a good-tempered existence, especially when this elf had repeatedly warned him not to disturb her to catch up on sleep. According to her own words, lack of sleep was the #1 enemy of beauty. But with Martha above, the heroic spirit didn't seem to need to care about this. Of course he wouldn't unwisely say this out loud. He could only smile and say, "Lord Saint Tassol, I have encountered a little trouble." Little trouble? The Wind Empress voice was startled. She had accompanied Brando for a long time, and she rarely heard him talk about his troubles. She pondered for a moment and asked, "Is it about the Planeswalker?" Brando was really shocked by this elf. "How did you know?" "Humph," the Wind Empress lightly snorted. "You are a freak. You have a lot of knowledge that even I don't know. It seems that the only thing that can confuse you is the inheritance of the Planeswalker." She paused for a moment and continued, "Tell me, what trouble have you encountered?" Brando hurriedly explained his predicament. Of course he skipped the part about the elemental activation task. After all, it was really difficult to explain. It was like trying to explain to the Shire what a cabbage that didn't exist in this world was. He changed to a more euphemistic way and told the Wind Empress that he had encountered a little trouble on the road to elemental activation. "You mean you can't touch the elemental wall, maybe because you are a Planeswalker?" The Wind Empress quickly listened to Brando's explanation, but immediately asked, "Why haven't I heard of the Darkness Dragon Odin having this problem?" "How would I know?" Brando spread his hands helplessly. The elf seemed to have caught the center of gravity. Do you have your own deck? This? Brando thought for a moment and replied seriously, I think I have one. Then you're really an idiot. Saint Tassel suddenly asked fiercely, Brando, you woke me up for such a stupid thing? I thought you were a smart guy. Wait, Brando reacted at this time. Wind Empress, what do you mean? You mean if I want to elemental activation I have to have my own deck of cards? Nonsense. The elf empress used her unique charming voice and concisely ended the discussion with Brando. To be continued. If you like this work you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 692. Elemental energy is a law. If you can't control your own power, how can you reach the realm of elemental energy? To put it simply, you have to be at least an official planeswalker to continue on this path. I was already curious. Brando, you've only been using other people's cards. At best you're an apprentice. How can you reach the level of elemental energy? Saint Tassel looked at him doubtfully. A possibility flashed through Brando's mind. It might be because he had two souls in one body. As one half of Sophie had inherited the legacy of a planeswalker, and the other half of Brando had inherited the bloodline of the Darkness Dragon. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. His thick eyebrows couldn't help but raise. Then what should I do? He asked, Lady Saint Tassel. How would I know? I'm not a planeswalker. The elven lady shrugged and glared at Brando. But you, as an apprentice of a planeswalker, why do you always act like a dabbler? Do all planeswalkers teach their apprentices like this? No wonder there are fewer and fewer inheritors of this legacy. Brando didn't know whether to laugh or cry. When he first opened the elemental pool, Tumen only told him the origin of this legacy and the history of how the Matatanians used this ability. Now that he thought about it, time was tight at the time. The Elemental Emperor might have only taught him a rudimentary skill to deal with terse pursuit. After all, he had to be alive to have the possibility of learning future knowledge. Later, in Kelsey's tomb, the dear Demoness taught him advanced combat skills. Although she also talked about the importance of pursuing one's own power, she didn't go into too much detail. In the end, it seemed that the Wind Empress wasn't wrong. On the path of a planeswalker, he looked like a dabbler no matter how he looked at it. But Brando thought for a moment and said, well, actually I'm not completely clueless. Yes. Tumen once told me, perfecting the rules of the world begins with the creation of your own basic deck. He said, actually, from the moment you come into contact with the first card of fate, you have already revealed your own deck. My deck is Tyrant of all classes. Brando said the term awkwardly. Fortunately, the Wind Empress did not notice it at all. She only looked at Brando with a deep gaze. So your inheritance came from that guy? Brando nodded. It seems that I have misinterpreted his meaning. I opened the path of a knight from the very beginning, but after that, I didn't continue on this path. Instead, I blindly enriched the world. Are you able to recognize that now? The Wind Empress raised her eyebrows slightly. It seems that you should have noticed something after I used that shameless woman to talk to you, right? Brando was sweating profusely. Of course, he knew that the shameless woman Saint Tassel was talking about was the dear Demoness Elaine. He coughed and said, more or less, so I have a rough idea of how to become an official planeswalker. What do you plan to do? Saint Tassel asked. Brando was silent for a moment. Although this was a decision he had made long ago during the Battle of Ampere Seal, when it really came down to it, he was still a little unwilling. After all, it was a very painful thing to give up the power that he had already obtained. But one path could lead to the highest peak, and the other path had already reached the peak. Brando knew what he should choose. I think now I want to go back to the original path. I want to become an apprentice again and then form my own law. I see. The Wind Empress had a slightly appreciative look in her eyes. It seems that you are still the Brando I know. You have not been blinded by power. She paused and asked, so, do you plan to do it now? Of course, Freya is still waiting for me up there. Brando replied, and then he waved his hand. At that moment, it was as if a world as deep as the universe had formed behind him. This scene was exactly the same as when Brando met Tumen that day, but his world was far less stable and vast than the Elemental Emperor's. It was as if it could envelop the entire world. Countless colorful lights flew out from this world. Silver Card Unicorn Knight, Medisha. Highland Mage the Shire. Holy Archangel. Sunblade. Golden Battle Flag. One by one, the cards that belonged to him appeared in front of him. They were arranged in an orderly manner like stars. And further away in Castle Abes in the Gars River, in the forests of Port Gris and the Maxon area. The apprentices in the Mage Tower suddenly realized that the Shire on the podium had disappeared without a trace. The tree elves who were talking to their commander lost sight of the Silver Fairy Princess in the next moment. Mephistopheles realized that Andrique in front of him was turning into nothingness. As soon as he stood up, he disappeared with the vampire's daughter in front of everyone's eyes. And everywhere in Abes, the mercenaries of Lopez became transparent one by one. They looked at each other and then seemed to melt under the sun. Echelonious spell weavers, glorious trumpeters, fireclaw lizardmen. The contractors who responded to Brando's summons gathered in front of Brando at the same time. Brando looked at them one by one. The Shire and Medisha, although they were on the cards, they were so lifelike that it was as if they could feel his gaze. And behind Brando, a small world formed by the Sacred Tree secret grounds, the market of the Shire of Roe, the Ruggen Swamp, the Ember Volcano, and the Storm Nest were floating in the void. This small world seemed to represent all of Brando's power. Saint Tassol the Wind Empress looked at this scene silently. She couldn't help but sigh in her heart. This was the power of a planeswalker. Even though he was just an apprentice, he had already mastered the core rules of this world, having his own world. And going one step further, they would truly become the masters of the world. Sometimes she didn't understand why there were planeswalkers in this world. They seemed to be outside of Martha's rules, but they didn't attract the attack of Martha's Tiamat law. Their identities and origins were an eternal mystery. What was the meaning of their existence? She squinted at all of this. But Brando had already made his final preparations. He waved his hand. The small world shattered with a bang. He frowned slightly. It was as if he could see his elemental pool collapsing into nothingness. The power of countless elements mixed together and converged into a point, as if it was the center of the universe. But in the darkest depths, energy, time, and space converged into a point, nurturing infinite power. All of the cards scattered in the air like trash. My lord, quickly stabilize your power. You can't control us anymore. Medisha's voice came from the air. My lord, stay calm. This was the Shire's words. I believe in you. Brando nodded. He stretched out his hands, and the deep space behind him seemed to be expanding infinitely, forming a universe that was being nurtured anew. He said calmly, I rule that this law will be born from this. The glorious knight trekked through the wilderness of Libusa with a bugle flag in his hand. The wind and dust didn't stain his determined face. His will was as tough as a blade. This is the Knight of Fran, glorifying him and his followers with holy power. He should first have a territory, Brando said. The Shire's market fell into his hands like gold falling from the sky. It fell into the dark universe and immediately formed a prosperous land. Plants grew luxuriantly on the golden soil. First, meadows grew out of the soil, then trees grew branches, and in the blink of an eye, green trees grew into shade. Then the migrating travelers came, and humans cut down trees to build a city. In the blink of an eye, a small town full of traffic appeared in front of Brando and Saint Tassol. Then the gem plain formed a rich land in front of the town. The water gurgled as if it could bring wealth from the distant sky. The nest of storms formed the background and the distant mountains stretched. This scene seemed familiar, but it was particularly different for Brando. Presumably, with the power given to him by Tumen, he had finally arrived at the call of the power of the law. It wasn't a world created by the Planeswalker himself. It was Martha's approval. Brendel's heart trembled. What he said was Fran's knight. His favorite knight in the Amber Sword was different from other knights who were either good at defense or good at offense. Fran's knight had a balanced ability to attack, retreat, and defend. He also had divine abilities. He wasn't as fast as a warrior or as strong as a priest, but he perfectly embodied the profession of knight. Fran's knight shared glory with his followers. He first set the market of the Shire's Shire, the Gem Plain, and the Nest of Storms as the source of the knight's power, and then continued, he should have followers. Followers, this was the core ability of Fran's knight. Fran's knight gained the ability to summon at level 15, allowing him to summon a team of followers on the battlefield. Whenever the Fran's knight leveled up, these followers also leveled up. Fran's knight wasn't good at offense, but as a standard aura and command role, he was very good at teamwork. Brando looked up. A card was then drawn. The Mercenaries of Lopez. But this familiar card completely changed in Brando's eyes. First of all, it became a silver rare grade card, and its attributes were also greatly changed. Other than the familiar pattern, even the name had been completely changed. White City Vanguard Eversong Iwin 5, Spell Instant, pay 20 mana. Night, the Franz Knight issued a call and placed a team of 12 mercenaries of Lopez into the field. Maintain, the mercenaries of Lopez, white derivative equivalent to Franz Knight level -10, will be maintained until the next day's reset. Since the 172nd year of the First Era, the mercenaries of Lopez have been known for their bravery and outstanding loyalty. Although this card was chosen by Brando himself, when he saw this card, he couldn't help but blurt out. He stared at the pattern on the card. The images of the Nightsong Tiger and Falerne sisters were very clear, but this card was obviously no longer the mercenaries of Lopez. What's going on? Brando never dreamed that a card that originally belonged to the City-States Alliance would inexplicably be added to Eversong. Moreover, the cost was greatly reduced, but it became a summoning magic card. He was slightly startled, and at the same time, he suddenly heard Saint Tassol's voice in his heart. At that moment, Brando also felt the fluctuation of energy at the same time. Both of them raised their heads at the same time. A 7-colored light suddenly shook in front of Brando, and a light door opened from it. This scene was familiar. Brando was about to call out that name, but a man in a silver robe had already walked out from behind the door. I said we will meet again. When you officially become a planeswalker. Brando. Tumen. Before Brando could even open his mouth, the Wind Empress had already called out. P.S. The 7th day. A champion who updates 10,000 times a day. Also, continue to ask for attention on Weibo. Asking for fans. Eternal Flame FF. This is my Weibo ID. I recommend Fathead Fish's book. The last time I called him Dumbhead Fish, he was not satisfied. Okay, actually this guy's real name is Yong Tai 6 Britannia. No, it's Silver Ash Frost. Actually, it's almost the same, anyway it's the same Chinibyu. The title of the book is Heart Hunting King's Power. It complements the author's ID. Book number 2268766. His introduction was too poorly written, so I decided to help him write a new one. This book tells the story of a Marxist materialist and a group of capitalist mages fighting a battle of wits and courage. Okay, that's Kyuso. Those who like psionic war mages can read this book. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 693. Before Brando could stop her, Saint Tassol the Wind Empress had already left the ring on his hand. It was as if a shadow had materialized beside him. As soon as she landed on the ground, she stared at the young man with black hair and red eyes who walked out from behind the door of light. She called out his name with certainty. Tumen. Tumen paused. Saint Tassol? The young man in a silver robe's red eyes suddenly lit up. Heroic spirit? The Moon Legacy? You also chose this little guy. It seems that my taste is not bad. Saint Tassol's slender brows furrowed slightly. She stared at the figure in front of her suspiciously. Tumen, you're not dead? Tumen smiled and spread his hands. My student, 1,000 years have passed. When we meet again after 1,000 years, is this still the first thing you care about? Brando stood aside and watched this scene. Historically, Tumen was a follower of the Darkness Dragon and had a relationship with the Four Sages. But according to historical records, Saint Tassol was indeed his student. Before the War of the Holy Saints, Tumen had taught the secrets of magic to all intelligent creatures and left precious knowledge like the sacred pattern. Seriously speaking, Gretel, Saint Tassol, and Fanzan of the Four Sages had a teacher-student relationship with Tumen. But Saint Tassol did not recognize this teacher. She looked at him coldly. In my opinion, this is not boring at all. Tumen, we worked so hard 1,000 years ago to achieve everything. I don't want to start all over again. Tumen smiled indifferently. My student, for 1,000 years, Gretel built the Cruz Empire on the Great Plains. How is his holy cathedral of fire today? What is the difference between the Cruz people today and the Erewhon people of the past? You built the holy cathedral of the Wind Empress, but your subordinates turned around and betrayed you. Where are the once glorious mist elves today? Among all of you, I admire Fanzan the most. But how many people still adhere to his doctrine today? The glory of White City is long gone. Your descendants are now killing each other for superficial interests. Compared to that dark age, today's world is nothing. Everyone has a dark side in their hearts. Gretel and I didn't build these kingdoms to make them last forever. What you can foresee, we've foreseen as well. Gretel's face sank slightly. Everyone has a dark side to them. It's just that you've also discovered that there needs to be a centralized country on this land in order to solve some problems. Back then, when you split it into 4, it doesn't seem like a wise choice. Tumen did not show any anger in the face of the Wind Empress' rebuke. He only replied softly. If you don't try, there won't be any results, Tumen. Tumen raised his eyebrows and asked, then what was the answer you got? Your soul is still lingering on a ring, lingering bitterly. What? History has already moved forward. Why are you still standing where you are? Saint Tossol choked and fell silent. Is he the one you chose, Saint Tossol? But Tumen did not seem to intend to continue forcing her. Instead he turned to look at Brando and asked, isn't he also the one you chose? The Wind Empress replied snappily. Her angry look made Brando very curious. He had only seen this great sage's confident and strong side. He had never seen her act like a child. Not only that, Saint Tossol quickly recovered and snorted coldly, your old boss, the Darkness Dragon Odin, and Kelsey also took a fancy to him. This little guy is not simple. Gretel's Scepter of Fire seems to have decided to choose him as its master. Before the great era comes, heroes are born. This is not strange. Only after experiencing an era can one see the future clearly. Tumen replied. You think too highly of him. The elf's expression was slightly sunken. I don't have as many complicated thoughts as you. I just want to find a successor. Tumen glanced at her and smiled but did not say anything. However, he did not intend to expose her. Instead, he looked at the newly born thin world of laws behind Brando. Around Brando, the cards of fate that belonged to him floated in the air and formed a circle. Ever since the Knight class was established, the world behind him had stabilized. The cards of fate that were originally scattered around no longer showed any signs of escaping his control. Brando, you reached this step faster than I thought. I thought you would need at least some time to understand the true meaning of power. Tumen could not help but praise after watching for a while. Hearing Tumen's words, Brando could not help but blush no matter how thick-skinned he was. If not for the dear Demoness telling him the true meaning of a planeswalker's power, he would probably still be addicted to power that did not belong to him. Saint Tossol clearly knew the inside story and could not help but snort softly. You flatter me, Lord Tumen. I have only recently understood these principles. Brando sighed. In fact, he really understood the unreliability of power that did not belong to him in the Battle of Amberlight. The experience of being pulled into the ultimate realm in the battle with Williams and almost being completely overturned was still vivid in his mind. It seems that you have encountered a lot of things. Tumen smiled gently, but these are not bad things. Whether the results are good or bad, the value of experience is the same for anyone. Moreover, it seems that you did not suffer much in these incidents. This is really just a fluke, Brendel thought to himself sadly. However, these were not his main concerns now. He was most concerned about the issue of the Planeswalker class change. After all, this was related to whether he could activate his elemental powers. He pondered for a moment and asked, Lord Tumen, are you here to reorganize my cards? More or less. Tumen nodded. You should now understand that the blueprint of the deck I set for you that day was only based on the understanding of your own world. But after all, it is not your own law. If you want to become a true Planeswalker, you must turn what I gave you into knowledge that truly belongs to you. Just like these cards? Brando looked at the White City Vanguard in the deck and said, Exactly. Tumen praised. Then what should I do next? He asked again. Don't you already have an idea in mind? You just have to follow your own ideas and do it. I am only here to tell you some of the laws that a true Planeswalker must abide by when you become an official Planeswalker. Tumen replied, as an apprentice, because he uses the power of others, the laws are far looser on him, but he will never be able to reach the ultimate realm. And once you become an official Planeswalker, you will soon understand the true meaning of this inheritance. The true meaning of a Planeswalker. Brando looked up. Just like what Tumen had said, ever since the battle in Amberlight, he had thought about his own deck countless times and now he had a rough framework. Although it was not to the extent of being detailed to every aspect, it was no problem to create this deck. So Brando nodded and said aloud, What belongs to a knight belongs to a knight. As soon as his voice fell, a silver light flashed in mid-air, and the cards fell one after another. As soon as the sun blade fell, it immediately turned into a silver hymn. In the Amber Sword, hymn was a basic skill of the Fran Knight. This was a special buff skill. It allowed the Fran Knight to sing hymn on the battlefield to destroy the undead and monsters, and at the same time generate a shield to resist black magic damage on his allies. This brand new card in Brando's eyes looked like this. Him Evernight I Light 2, spell, pay XMP Knight lower level, the Fran Knight sings him, dealing X points of damage to non-white creatures, monsters, undead. At the same time, place X counters on each friendly creature, and remove 1 counter for each point of damage from black spells. O glorious holy temple, look at the pure white flames descending from the heavens, covering the army like a pair of wings. Then came the parallel charge, which became the group charge of the Fran Knight. Group charge Evernight IV Earth 2, spell, pay 1 glory. The Fran Knight allows his followers to gain the group ability. Maintain. The group charge will be maintained until the reset time of the next day. I saw it with my own eyes. The Sabri people charged with a scream, and an army of tens of thousands collapsed in front of them. Baron Vassar and Caden. Group ability, when creatures with the same ability within a certain range receive a 1% damage bonus. For every additional creature with this ability, the damage will increase by an additional amount. Next was the Golden Battle Flag, Silver Colt, and Holy Sword. They became Encourage, Cavalry Readiness, and Heaven's Armor respectively. Encourage Evernight V-Light 5, spell, pay half MP Knight. The Fran Knight encourages all allies to level up, current level +5. Maintain. Encourage will be maintained until the reset time of the next day. My glory is your glory. Cavalry Readiness Evernight VI Earth 1, spell, pay X MP. The Fran Knight allows X followers to become cavalry. If they are already cavalry, they will receive the ability to fly. Maintain. Cavalry Readiness will be maintained until the reset time of the next day. Banners like the sea, spears piercing through the forest. The knight is ready to go. Heaven's Armor Evernight Veil Light 4, spell, pay X MP. The Fran Knight summons X number of holy swords from the sky to attack the enemy, dealing 5 points of damage. When the light of judgment plows through the battlefield, the undead army is reduced to ashes. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 694. Whitetown Vanguard, Holy Song, Group Charge, Encourage, Cavalry Readiness, and Heaven's Armor. 6 cards fell into Brando's hand and stacked together. Brando withdrew his hand, and all the cards turned into countless white mysterious runes and lines of law that merged into his chest. Seeing this, Tumen could not help but ask, "Isn't 6 cards too little for a single deck?" Brando smiled confidently, then shook his head. "Interesting, I think I understand what you're thinking." The Elemental Emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints pondered for a moment, then said, "You want to put the abilities of every profession in the world into your deck, combining them into one, and use the cards of fate to simulate completely different power systems. Good idea. But there are many kinds of professions in WoD. Can you use cards to simulate all of them?" Of course, Brando had already considered these questions and he replied confidently, WoD has experienced thousands or even tens of thousands of years of history, and thousands of professions have evolved. Even different inheritances of different organizations can evolve into 2 completely different professions. For example, the Wind Elf Star Knight and Steel Scale are both inheritances of the Star Inheritance, but the skills they master are completely different. However, he changed the topic. The root of the problem is that the power system on the continent of Vaunt can only be divided into 12. Among them, the professions that pursue the limits of battle skills and explore their own potential are divided into 2. Warriors, mercenaries, swordsmen, and even the noble knight can be classified into one of them. Archers and assassins, who pursue lightness and agility, are on the other side of the scale. There are also wizards who explore the mysteries of the law, such as law wizards, flux mages, and charm warlocks. Then there are the rulers of the elements, elementalists. You must be familiar with this profession, Emperor. Next, there are warlocks, witches, necromancers, and followers of chaos who control chaos and dark magic. They are the best of the best. Then there are those who control the balance of nature. Druids and tree herders are mortal enemies, but they are born from this. Then there are Alice and Helene, the beloved of the twin goddesses, those who interpret fate, and astrologers are the representatives of this. Tumen's eyes lit up when he heard Brando's explanation of the professions. It was the first time in 1,000 years that he had heard someone divide the power system of the continent in this way. And the more he listened, the more he felt that Brando's words made sense. Not only the Elemental Emperor, but even Saint All could not help but listen to him. Legend had it that an era ago, before Ababel Fortress had fallen, and the Grand Library was still well preserved with information from the era of the Divine People, people had indeed divided the power of the world into several systems. But after the disaster, all knowledge and these precious documents were lost their whereabouts. Tumen listened carefully to Brendel's explanation and increasingly felt that this might be the truth. He could not help but narrow his eyes. He did not understand why this young man in front of him could see the essence of power so clearly. Of course, the Elemental Emperor perhaps. What Brando was talking about was actually the introduction to the Amber Sword's power on the official website. If there was anyone who was not clear about this introduction, it would probably be those who had never played the game. Brando continued, however, in addition to the power of nature and the law, as well as the magic of chaos, the law of Tiamat also promises the power of holiness to the world. The secular Hilmer divine system holds the power of creation. The priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the priests of the Holy Cathedral of Wind worship this divine system, so they hold the power of healing. The arrogant Inca divine system controls the sword of destruction. Lightning and holy flames are their authority. The Knight of the Holy Cathedral believes in arbitration and judgment. After that is the power of the mind. The power of the mind is born in the spirit, language and sound. Bards and psionic warlocks are rare, but they are not legends. In addition, the magical technology that extends from the power of magic has brought alchemists and mechanics. There is also a more special power system. Brando suddenly said. Before Tumen could speak, the Wind Empress could not help but let out a curious sound. But then she seemed to feel a little embarrassed and could not help but snort coldly. Brando had been with this elf lady for a long time. How could he not understand what she was thinking? He quickly explained, this power system is special, not that it is weak. It should be said that it has existed before or it only exists in fantasy. What class? Saint Tassel finally could not help but say, damn you Brando, don't keep me guessing. That's because you are too anxious, Lady Wind Empress? Brando was about to say this, but the former glared at him. He could only reply helplessly, actually I don't know, I just heard about it. Heard about it? The Wind Empress stared at him suspiciously. Yes. Brando nodded, but he knew that it was not just hearsay. It was that he could not explain the existence of this class for the time being. The Interpreter of the Slate, a gift from the era of the gods. A class that players could never touch in this era, how could he explain it? The elf lady seemed to trust Brando. She looked at him silently and finally nodded. In other words, the power system of the entire Wand world is divided into these 12? In fact, it should be 11. Although swordsmen and archers look very different in the army, there is no difference in the nature of their power. Saint Tassel was very knowledgeable, and her words immediately made Tumen nod. Brando also nodded. You can say that. In short, although there are thousands of classes in the world of Wand. But in the end, it is only formed by the intertwining of these 12 power systems. For example, the Rangers of the Ring of Sky and the Ring of Raptors are actually just warriors who master archers and the path of nature at the same time. But time is fair to everyone. Most people who take care of multiple power systems are often not as far as those who pursue one path. Of course, there are a few of them who are outstanding. Brendel explained, and if I want to perfect my deck, all I need to do is to pick a few classes that I need, and those that are representative of them will be enough. For example, the Knight of Farron or the Silver Wizard of Buga. After listening, Tumen frowned and thought for a moment, then sighed, well said. Although there may be some omissions in the details, it is basically like that. Whether it is the gold or silver folk or the black iron folk, in fact, they are just operating under these power systems. But even so, have you ever thought that there is another problem? He looked at Brando and became serious. Although your deck can include all the power systems and turn them into one, have you ever considered that because of the restrictions of the law of existence on switching decks, in fact, you can only use one or two of them at any time? And the power of a planeswalker is of a higher level than these power systems. Don't you think it is too wasteful to waste it on simulating these low-end power systems? Secondly, because most of your cards are spells, it is easy to be countered. And this is one of the biggest taboos that planeswalkers pursue. Tumen was worthy of being a long-established and experienced planeswalker. With just a little thought, he saw the fatal weakness of Brando's deck, at least in his opinion. Because for any planeswalker, their lifelong pursuit was a perfect cycle of cards. So the more restrained the deck was, the less significance it had in their eyes. The ultimate system was the first lesson that a planeswalker apprentice had to learn. But after hearing Tumen's words, Brando gently shook his head. No, Lord Tumen, I don't think so. Planeswalkers pursue the ultimate and perfection, but in thousands of years has anyone succeeded? Tumen was stunned. He could not help but look up at the gloomy sky of the Greyhill Mountains. The history under the sky had been repeated for thousands of years. But history was like a cycle, and no one had ever broken through the final result. Had a planeswalker ever succeeded? Of course not, otherwise why would they spend their lives searching? Brando smiled. I have experienced a battle before. He remembered the battle with Williams, and that last thrilling moment would forever be engraved in his heart. He replied, the experience of this battle made me understand that no matter how perfect the cycle is, it is impossible to face all situations. So, I think that perfection is only a relative state, he said with assurance. How to achieve a more perfect state in a battle compared to the enemy? Actually, we are all wrong because the answer is very simple. We just need to become stronger than him. In order to achieve this goal, all power can be borrowed. As long as the advantage is focused on one moment, all tricks will vanish. Tumen looked at Brando. This elemental emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints took a deep breath. I know a few old friends who have the same idea as you. They pursue extreme violence. As long as the enemy is destroyed, everything is meaningless. But they failed. Do you know why? Because there is always a taller mountain, and there will always be someone stronger than him. The so-called concept of being the strongest is just an ideal. Brando blurted out without thinking. You know? Tumen was slightly startled and looked at the young man curiously. Yes. Brando smiled, but I am different from them. Because I also know that one person can never be stronger than a team. He enunciated each and every word clearly. A single person can never be stronger than a team. After a certain period of time, this sentence was repeatedly mentioned in his memory. That distinct and amiable face, with its hands on its waist and its long black hair draped over its shoulders, also spoke to them word by word. Always remember, one person can never be stronger than a team. This is a game of division of labor and cooperation. I do not welcome individual heroism. Especially you, Sophie. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but smile slightly. But in front of him, Tumen was already deeply frowning. He suddenly thought of something and raised his head in shock. Wait, that guy Kelsey? Are you thinking of doing this? Brando looked at the elemental emperor's expression and knew that he had completely understood. He nodded and replied, Yes, Emperor. In fact, before this trip I had already decided. When I received Sir Kelsey's inheritance, the most precious inheritance I received was not his cards, but his knowledge. Tumen let out a long breath. Planeswalkers each had their own characteristics. But when it came to Kelsey's specialty, it was not his black and white, the endless paradise of adversity. It was the theory he created in the last moments of his life. Planeswalker creatures. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 695. The deer-bodied demoness Helene and the pendulum golem. In fact, their appearance had piqued Brando's curiosity. After the battle in the underground tomb, he finally found out that the summoned creatures of cards could also use cards. Helene had said that she and the pendulum golem had only used Kelsey's cards in a simulated environment. But at least this proved that the great planeswalker must have had similar ideas when he was alive. And this was indeed the case. Kelsey had left behind some records. In his later years he had this idea to establish a new law on the creature cards. If a planeswalker could summon all creatures, why couldn't a planeswalker summon other planeswalkers? This was undoubtedly a bold idea that bordered on genius. It was not an exaggeration to say that this idea was bold and imaginative. And the craziest thing was that Kelsey had succeeded. Or rather, he had succeeded in some sense. He first reassembled the deer-bodied demoness and the pendulum golem, two of the strongest cards he had, and the ones he had the deepest feelings for. It could be said that Helene and the pendulum golem were his first experimental subjects. This experimental subject was not perfect, but it gave Kelsey a direction. But it was a pity that this great genius, or rather madman, could not complete his idea. Before he could create a perfect summoned creature, an unknown danger from the underground of Tanajul erupted. He and the Witch Empress chose to use their lives to seal the entire tomb. They also sealed his life's work within it. And this record was eventually passed to Brando by the deer-bodied demoness. In fact, what Brando obtained was not the complete idea, because even Kelsey did not have the time to perfect it. What was left to him was only a record full of flaws. But this was enough. Just like Brando's idea, it did not need to be perfect, but as long as it could be used to its fullest potential. With the experience of his previous life, it was not impossible for him to create the strongest deck of cards that belonged only to him. You want to summon a planeswalker creature? Tumen looked at him and asked nervously. Brando nodded. Tumen immediately put on a serious expression and asked, But do you know that Kelsey's method is not perfect? After all, a planeswalker has a special authority. He is above all the power systems you mentioned. His method of summoning a planeswalker creature is actually a compromise. I know, Brando replied. Master Kelsey actually shared his authority as a planeswalker so that his summoned creatures would have the same power as his own. There are two problems. First, the sharing of the authority will reduce the limit of the planeswalker's card deck. Second, the summoned creatures will have the same authority as the planeswalker, so they can turn against the planeswalker at any time. Brendel was actually a person who was keen on seeking victory in the midst of danger. He was completely different from those who were cautious and meticulous in their actions. That was why Senpai paid the most attention to him when he was in the Amber Sword. It's the result of a person's idea. He's. The most important thing is to know your enemy as well as yourself. Therefore he didn't need Tumen to say anything. He had already investigated all the consequences. Apart from that, he continued, the authority of a planeswalker can't be shared infinitely. With Kelsey's, he can only share 4 additional authorities. With Mai's I can only have 2 at most. So you understand that. Tumen fell silent. Brando's card deck's capacity was a problem that all planeswalkers had to face. Unlike apprentices who could use other people's card decks without any scruples, every card in a planeswalker's hand was the embodiment of his own law and the construction of the world. Therefore he had to reserve a certain amount of power for each card to maintain. This relationship was generally proportional to the size of the elemental pool. It was usually 10-1, but there was no lack of smaller or larger pools. Tumen thought for a moment and said, Kelsey is almost at the peak of planeswalkers. His power can be said to be on par with mine. Above that would be Lord Odin's level. Since ancient times, there have only been 2 or 3 people at that level. That is to say, even if you consider going down this path, you can only have 4 or 5 planeswalker creatures at most. Also, you have to consider carefully. These planeswalker creatures themselves have a lot of drawbacks. I've thought about it, Lord Tumen. Although I still thank you for your reminder, Brando smiled, I think this is my best choice. The Elemental Emperor couldn't help but shake his head. He couldn't help but glance at the Saint Tassel who had been watching the show coldly and said, This is also your precious student. Aren't you going to persuade him? The Wind Empress spread her hands, This is your planeswalker's business. Besides, I believe in this little guy. Nothing he has done so far has been wrong. Can you believe this? This in itself is a miracle. Tumen was slightly stunned and couldn't help but fall silent for a moment. Then he raised his head and asked, You've thought it through? Then what do you plan to do? Leave it to me, Brando was confident. He had been thinking about this moment since he left the catacombs. After going through the Battle of Ampere Seal, he saw his own thoughts clearly. Moreover, he was hiding a secret that he couldn't tell anyone. He only hoped to verify his conjecture. If it was true, then his path as a planeswalker in the future would be unimaginable. I want to first confirm the core card of the Night deck. First, I need to reshape my elemental pool and card library. Tumen nodded. Very good. Unknown laws are dangerous for anyone. It's a good thing to do things steadily. Then I'll watch from here. You can start. Brando nodded and then drew a card from the air. The pattern on the card was so familiar. Under the curtain of stars, a female knight holding a spear and her unicorn were walking through the forest together. This quiet scene seemed to tell a story from 1,000 years ago to the present day. The Medisha in the picture was the same as when they first met in the Eternal Song Forest. Medisha, have you thought it through? Brando asked. This may not be a good thing for you. It may take away your eternal life. The girl's voice smiled slightly as if it came from the void. My lord, Medisha has already said that it is my honor to be able to follow my lord. Besides, my lord, have you forgotten that Medisha's eternal life is built on your cards? Brando understood. He was slightly moved. Most planeswalkers would more or less consider the backlash of summoning creatures when they gave away their authority. But he was sure that Medisha would never do anything to harm him. He stretched out his hand and pointed at the card. According to the method recorded by Kelsey, he extended his law onto the card. Tumen and Saint Tassel who were present saw that at that moment, the dazzling silver line of law extended from Brando's body and then wrapped around the Unicorn Knight's card. The silver line of law was even more stable than Brando's spatial law. It vibrated slightly in the stone circle. For a moment, the entire spatial law seemed to resonate with it as if bowing down to this supreme law. However, after a moment, a dark golden card slid out from the wrapping of the line of law and fell into Brando's hand. Fran Knight Eternal Song I Light 30, Creature. Fran Knight, Silver Elf, Level 1. When the Fran Knight enters the field, it has 60 MP ability, Planeswalker. Tap, restores 10 MP. Maintain, the Fran Knight is a permanent object on the field. Her loyalty is like the straightest sword. She would rather be broken than bent. Planeswalker ability. A summoned creature with the Planeswalker ability can use the cards of fate from its summoner's elemental pool like a real Planeswalker. It can gain experience and use equipment like normal. But once a summoned creature with the Planeswalker ability runs out of MP or life, it will be completely destroyed. Time seemed to flow quietly for a few seconds. Tumen, Brando, and Saint Tassol just looked at the dark golden card. After a long while, the Elemental Emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints could not help but sigh. Although I don't support you doing this, I have to admit that Kelsey is really a genius. In the world of exploring the power of law, I am far inferior to him. This card has already rewritten the history of Planeswalkers. Tumen's eyes revealed an expression as if he was looking at a piece of art. He even looked a little obsessed. But after a while, Tumen could not help but shake his head. But this kind of law may not be the best for you, Brando. Do you understand? Because you may have to work 1,000 times harder than others. You and I have both forgotten one thing. He continued to add, although they are Planeswalker creatures, the land cards and elemental pools they use are still your own. If you have 4 Planeswalker creatures, then the ratio of land cards in your deck will probably drag down the combat power of your entire deck. The Elemental Emperor raised his head as if wanting to comfort Brando, but he immediately found that the young man he had always admired was just standing there in a daze. Brando? It was not just Tumen. Even Saint Tassol at the side noticed the abnormality. They saw that a bright flame seemed to light up in Brando's eyes, and a strange smile appeared on his face. Soon, the latter raised his head a little stiffly like a puppet. He glanced at Saint Tassol, then at Tumen, and then said dryly, "You guys better look at this thing." "What?" "My elemental pool." Brando faced Tumen and the Wind Empress and suddenly closed his eyes. His left hand and right hand overlapped, and the power of magic and elemental immediately began to gather in his magic triangle area. In just a moment, the Elemental Emperor's eyes widened. This is impossible. Wone's history was long and complicated. In the long river of history, there were very few people who could be called Elemental Emperors. Tumen was one of the best. His talent as an elementalist was unprecedented. Later folklore said that when he opened his elemental pool, the astrologers at that time announced the birth of a future Elemental Emperor. This was because Tumen was probably the only one in Wone who had just opened his elemental pool and the capacity of all elements reached 100 slots. However, even Tumen himself had never seen or heard of such a possibility. He had never even considered the possibility of such a thing happening. 2 elemental pools. Brando had 2 elemental pools. At that moment, Tumen and Saint Tassol almost thought that there was something wrong with their eyes. They made an action that was extremely unbefitting of their status at the same time, and subconsciously rubbed their eyes. However, they immediately noticed that the other party was doing the same thing and realized that there was a problem. This was actually true. There was actually someone who had 2 elemental pools at the same time. Tumen looked at Brando, and finally could not maintain his usual calm and composure. He could not help but grab Brando's shoulder. Of course, his subconscious action only allowed his hand to pass through Brando's body like a shadow. This Elemental Emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints grabbed empty air, and then remembered that he was just an image. But this did not calm his shock. He could not help but ask in astonishment, "Brando, what is going on?" Brando looked at the 2 people in front of him with some surprise. Of course he knew what was going on. Finally, after a long wait, after officially crossing that invisible barrier and officially becoming a Planeswalker, he, as the other half of Sophie's soul, finally had his own elemental pool. And it was far more than just this time. He found that his 2 souls had the same authority in the power system of Planeswalkers. What did this mean? Brando almost laughed wildly in his heart. As expected, he had guessed correctly. He could separate 2 times more authority than a normal person. P.S. Today's 3 chapters involve a lot of settings. I spent a lot of time describing them to make the settings seem reasonable. That's why I dragged it out so late, equals. I feel that even writing 30,000 words a day is not so tiring. It's too mentally exhausting. I'm really tired. I hope everyone can support me more. In addition, this is the 9th day. I'll update 10,000 times a day. I'll update another day tomorrow. I've almost made up for the debt from last month, so I may start another chapter tomorrow. Everyone please support me. Go to hell, the strong baboon. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 696. What did double the authority mean? It meant that at his peak he could even summon 8 or more planeswalker creatures to fight for him. Each of these planeswalker creatures was like him. They could level up, equip powerful magic items, and even use cards of fate. Therefore, one could imagine, with the support of the double elemental pool, after each round of card grabs, how spectacular would it be if 9 planeswalkers at their peak attacked at the same time. In the face of such a huge advantage, the flaws in the eyes of ordinary planeswalkers, and the flaws that Tumen was worried about, were long gone. Thinking of this, Brando couldn't help but tremble a little as he closed his eyes. If it was said that he was a little hesitant before he officially chose this path, but at this moment, after truly confirming his thoughts, he finally understood that a planeswalker's path that belonged only to him had been engraved in the history of this world. This was the true path to perfection and the limit. It was unique and could not be replicated. In the eyes of others, it was as difficult as ascending to the heavens, but in Brando's eyes, it was so fitting for him. Double elemental pool, double authority, and even this set of cards to him only needed to consider a large amount of equipment, experience, and the capacity of the elemental pool. As a veteran warrior who had been reborn, Brando happened to be the part that he was best at. Because Brando could be sure that in this world, except for the gods and the pale poem that recorded everything, there was probably no one who knew more secrets than him. Whether it was the past, the future, or the present. But all of this to Brando was not some kind of luck or coincidence, because no one knew him better than himself. Before he embarked on this path, even the moment when Brando received Kelsey's manuscript, he knew that this was the path that was most suitable for him. And now, every single detail confirmed his thoughts. After he closed his eyes for a moment, he opened them again. The mountains reflected in his eyes, and at that moment, the undulating mountain range gave him some kind of illusion, as if the whole world was under his feet. This was the power that belonged only to planeswalkers, using everything as a blade and the world as a battlefield. Brando let out a long breath as if to express this feeling from his heart. He slowly let go of his hands, and the power of the elements also collapsed in his palms. At that moment, Tumen and Saint Tassol looked at this scene with some regret. The 2 elemental emperors and the king of sages from the era of the War of the Holy Saints seemed to be in a trance, as if a miracle was disappearing from their vision and no longer. It was indeed a miracle. But compared to Tumen and Saint Tassol's judgment, the way Brando saw the miracle was more direct. The 2 elemental pools on his left and right were like 2 trembling light in the air, clearly showing him the complete data: frowny face fire, 2020, wind, 2020 earth, 2020, water, 2020, light, 4040, dark, 10, nature, fire 6060, wind, 6060, 6060, 60, 6060, dark, 1N, nature, 6060. There were 2 elemental pools, one big and one small. The smaller one obviously belonged to Brando's soul. After all the elements were initialized, the natural elemental pool was still 0. This could only mean that Brando himself was not fated with the druid's power system. However, after being bestowed by Martha, his affinity with the light element was still far ahead, even more than double that of the other elements. And the other one was even more outrageous. As an initial elemental pool, the capacity of all attributes was as high as 60. The dark elemental pool was so high that it was impossible to look at it directly. Although this capacity was far less than that of the elemental emperor Tumen back then, it was still an unimaginable number compared to those who had a certain amount of elementalist talent, or those who were recommended to study at St. Tassol's Talim Elemental Academy or Atlanta's Howling Hall. In fact, Brando himself could not believe that half of Sophie's soul would have such a strong elemental affinity. "Look at your deck," Tumen suddenly shouted. Brando actually realized the same problem. He opened the panel, and 2 sets of numbers immediately dazzled his eyes. 6, 10, 13, 20, 2 elemental pools meant that there were 2 separate card pools. Although he had expected this, Brando still felt a little suffocated when he saw this scene. He silently looked at the panel, then looked up at Tumen. Although he did not speak, the meaning in his eyes was self-evident. 2 decks. Tumen sucked in a breath of cold air. He was about to lose his mind. Brando nodded. In the name of Martha, it seemed like a short while or a long time had passed. For a moment, the strange scene on the platform made it difficult for the 3 of them to realize the passage of time. The roaring mountain wind between the mountains seemed to be an annotation of this moment. After what seemed like a century, Saint Tassol seemed to have finally recovered from the previous shock. "Brando, Odin really has good taste. What is going on?" But before Brando could answer this question, Tumen interrupted them. The young man stared at Brando with his blood-red eyes and asked, "Brando, did you expect this?" Brando was slightly startled. He did not expect the Elemental Emperor to be so sharp as to notice this. He hesitated. This was one of his biggest secrets. If he could, he would rather keep it a secret. But in the next moment he changed his mind and nodded slightly. "Yes, but I don't know how to explain it, Lord Tumen." "Then there's no need to explain," Tumen replied solemnly. He looked at Brando seriously and sighed. "Perhaps one day you will become a legend among planeswalkers, Brando." Brendel sucked in a breath of air. The reason why he said this was to not lose the other party's trust. After all, his planeswalker legacy was inherited from this elemental emperor. Moreover, the other party's heroic soul might have already become one of the stars in the sky above Wond. He did not have to worry about the other party seeing through anything. And Tumen did not disappoint him. The elemental emperor paused for a moment and continued to ask, "So, you have now determined your path. How are you going to choose the cards in your hand?" Brando knew that this was the main event. The card library's capacity was 4, 10, and 12, 20. The former represented the maximum limit of his card library. The latter represented the number of cards he could temporarily possess and did not need to add to his card library. After entering the domain of official planeswalkers, because of the clear boundaries of the laws, planeswalkers could no longer walk around with cards that belonged to others as they could when they were apprentices. After all, cards that came from different laws would inevitably conflict with the planeswalker's own laws. Once this conflict exceeded a certain limit, there would be a serious backlash. The consequences of the backlash would be the destruction of the cards. In the worst case, the planeswalker would be implicated and even completely destroy the planeswalker's own laws. This kind of incident had happened before in history. The moment Brando officially advanced into a planeswalker, his mind seemed to automatically have memories of this knowledge. However, he had already considered these problems and replied without hesitation, "I've already thought about it. But before that, I plan to instantiate the second authority." "The second authority?" Tumen raised his head and looked at Brando's cards and asked, "This time, which one of the 12 power systems are you going to choose?" "This time I plan to appoint people by favoritism." Brando smiled and raised his head. His gaze swept to another card in the air and asked, "The Shire, are you ready?" "I'm ready to level up at any time, my lord." The Shire's voice was full of confidence in him as usual. "I'm afraid you won't level up, but you'll have to go back to zero first. From now on, you can't die and come back to life, live and die again. Have you thought about it?" Brando became serious. "Don't say it like dying and coming back to life. Living and dying seems to be a very happy thing, my lord." The Shire's voice could not help but complain. "Besides, to be able to leave the category of cards and be more like a normal person, this is already a great favor for this humble one." "Then I understand." Brando nodded. "This time is the opposite of the last time. I'll start with you as the core to instantiate this set of cards." As he spoke, he stretched out his hand and pointed it forward. "I rule, this law will be born from this." The white holy tower flashed in the clouds, and the mage holding the long scroll walked on the holy ladder. The voice echoed on the platform. The holy tree mysteriously fell into his hand as if the clouds were gathering in the air. It fell between the clouds. Immediately, white spires rose. The spires shone brightly under the sun. Then, the white streets, corridors and bridges seemed to materialize from the colorful light. Mages with long scrolls in their hands walked out of the spires, and in the blink of an eye, they used mysterious magic to create a glorious city. In the center of the city, a giant tree rose from the ground. The branches as white as ivory supported the emerald tree crown and shrouded the entire city. Under the city that floated above the clouds, the blue sea formed the background of the entire world. Brando then put in the ember volcano, and the shadow of the mountain suddenly emitted thick smoke at the end of the sky. The two land cards merged into this new world, and the chaotic world immediately stabilized. Only then did Brendel have the time to look at the blue world of the sea and the great plains next to it. Both worlds were suspended in the void like two small sandboxes. Then he said, "This is your world, the Shire." "Thank you, my lord." The Shire's voice laughed. Brando pointed and replied, "I named Medish's world Faerun, which means the glory of the plains. And your world is called Bainka. This blue sea is the source of your power. It is the symbol of the silver mages, noble, mysterious, elegant, and ever-changing. Silver mages have stood at the peak of the law for thousands of years. Their power comes from the wisdom and the exploration of knowledge that they are proud of. He reached out his hand and the Shire's card was already in his palm. Silver flames seemed to be burning on the card. After the flames burned, the dark gold color of the card was revealed. Silver-robed Mage Law I Waiter 30, creature. Silver-robed Mage Human, level 1. When the silver-robed mage enters the field, he has 100 mana. Ability, Planeswalker. Tap restores 20 mana. Maintain, the silver-robed mage is a permanent object on the field. The words flowing between the scrolls are the key to opening the door of power. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 697. Magic Refraction Law I Water 3, Spells, pay X mana, Wizard, target the target spell and make it choose X new targets. After this card is used, shuffle it into the deck. I am in charge of your magic, Obelisk Guard ODU. Ether Dragon Law I Water 25, creature, elemental creature Pseudo-Dragon, level 35. Pay X mana, Wizard, X must be an integer of 10, place X Ether Dragons into the field. Pay 3 water, move the Ether Dragons out of the battle. Each Ether Dragon has 3 counters, remove 1 counter every 10 minutes, and restore a point of mana for all allies. When all counters are removed, place the Ether Dragons back into the field. Maintain, the Ether Dragons will be maintained until the time of reset. Energy is always switching forms at every moment. Mirror Image Law IV Water 20, spells pay 10 X MP Wizard, and choose X Blue, Water, or Cyan Wind, creatures. If you do this, Mirror Image will duplicate the same number of creatures. Maintain, Mirror Image will last for an hour. You are me, I am you. Brendel looked up at the cards in the sky. Energy Loss, Wind Spirit Spiders and Rune Summoner turned into Mana Refraction, Ether Dragon, and Mirror Image respectively and fell into his hands. Just like what had happened before, all the cards were automatically upgraded to silver level. Putting away these cards, Brando only had 3 empty slots in his deck, barely enough for him to build another deck. He looked at the cards floating in the air and had a plan in mind. A complete team in addition to a knight and a wizard, naturally needed a healer. Although there was Maria in the territory, the fiancée of Kargleis was too weak, and as for the other priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, he might not be able to trust them. Therefore, using the cards of fates to build a priest profession was, in fact, an urgent matter for Brando. He drew a card from the air. Originally, the most suitable Planeswalker card for a priest deck was undoubtedly the Pristine Archangel, but considering that it was a permanent calling card in the field, it was a bit too ostentatious to parade around with a winged birdman. After some thought, Brando chose the Radiant Trumpeter from Pure Heaven. He wasn't familiar with that set of cards. He hesitated for a moment before asking, "What is your name?" "My name is Hipamera, Master Planeswalker." A gentle girl's voice replied. "All right, Hipamera, are you willing to give up your immortal body and become a Planeswalker?" Brando asked. The voice in the card paused for a moment before asking in delight, "Can I?" "As long as you're willing." "Of course I'm willing, Sir Planeswalker," Hipamera replied without hesitation. "Very well, accept my law." Brando gently took off the card and pointed at a land card. "I will use the name of Sacred Mountain Paragon to establish a holy kingdom. It will be the birthplace of faith, the source of the sacred flame." The mountains of Anjou then fell to the ground, and a grayish-white wilderness and plateau rose between Belinka and Farlan. Although it was uninhabited, the scenery above the sacred white plateau was magnificent, as if it was filled with a sacred aura. Then the Radiant Trumpeter card slipped from the silver cocoon of the Threads of Law and fell into his palm. Brando looked down and saw that the face of the Radiant Trumpeter card had indeed turned into a quaint dark gold, and the name had also changed to Priestess Himelud. Priestess Himelud was a famous priest-like profession in Atlanta. It was the opposite of the aggressive scepter priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The priestesses who believed in the eldest daughter of the earth goddess Gaia and the tundra goddess Himelud were good at defense. They lived an ascetic life under the sacred mountain, so much so that they were called the shepherdesses of Himelud. And this card was described as follows: Priestess Himelud Belief I Earth 30, creature. Priestess Himelud Human, level 1. When Priestess Himelud entered the field, she had 100 mana. Ability Planeswalker. Tap recover 20 mana. Maintain, Priestess Himelud is on the field as a permanent. Persevere in your beliefs, never wavering like a rock, and you will be blessed by the Spirit of the Mountains, Braid Silverfire. Then Brando read, Spirit of the Mountains, bless your people. A card fell from the air, and on the card was Enroldo's holy ring. But the silver fire ignited from the card, and in the blink of an eye, it turned into the Song of Blessing. The Song of Blessing was a signature skill that Priestess Himelud learned when she reached level 40 and met the conditions for her first profession change. Simply put, it was group invincibility. This skill essentially changed Priestess Himelud's weak position, and it was from this skill that Priestess Himelud became a legendary priestess. And now, the card in front of Brando was described as follows. Song of Blessing Belief II Light 10, Earth 10, Spell, pay 25x mana and choose X targets to nullify the next attack on them. Maintain the effect of the Song of Blessing lasts for 10 minutes. The ethereal hymn breaks the long sword, the mountains of Anru, Priestess Himelud, and the Song of Blessing fell into Brando's hands in turn, automatically stacking into a stack. Then white flames ignited, turning into countless mysterious runes that merged into Brando's body. Brando closed his eyes slightly, and the third deck of cards was also formed. And at this moment he had chosen all 19 cards of fate in the two decks. But there were still a large number of cards floating in the air, and Brando had to choose 30 of them to keep, and the rest could only be left to dissipate into the void. Of course, it was impossible not to feel heartache about this kind of thing, but he had no choice. He turned his head, and both Tumen and Saint Tassol stared at him. Although the Wind Empress didn't seem to understand what all this meant, she could see that Brando was about to make a difficult choice. The two nodded at him in unison. Brando let out a soft sigh of relief. In fact, he already had a plan in mind. First of all, he naturally wouldn't give up on those cards that he had deep feelings for. Although it sounded a little strange, but just like Kelsey, the Deer Demoness, and the Pendulum Golem, that great planeswalker would definitely not give up on these two assistants that had been with him for many years. Even if they were just cards. Brando raised his head, and first chose the Fireclaw Lizardman Lord, Fireclaw Lizardman, Fireclaw Trumpeter, Bloodthrone Vampire Mephistopheles, Night Lord Andrique, and the always unlucky Fire Giant and Pristine Archangel. These cards had been with him for a certain period of time, and in comparison he would rather waste a slot for them than choose the more powerful cards. Because although Brando pursued power, it didn't mean that he was going to be a cold and heartless person. Then there were the resource cards: Water of the Dark Realm, Forest of Death, Rich Gold Mine, Sea Wave Gem, Silver Swallowtail Flag, Tax Officer of Grey Harbor, Draws Wilderness, and Ruggin Swamp. Because he didn't have many resource cards to begin with, and now that he had to support the huge consumption of several planeswalkers, these cards naturally couldn't be easily given up. Finally, there were the powerful cards such as the Grimoire of Life, Impasse Trojan Horse, 2 Accelerated Thinking, 2 Anxiety Disorder, and Lightning Storm. Then there were Daybreak, Echelon's Furnace of Adversity, Echelon's Spellweaver, 2 High Spirits, Radiant Martyr, and Graveyard Rebirth. Finally, he also used the card wealth that he had accumulated over the past few days to unlock the Platinum Angel that had been with him for a long time. Just like that, all 30 cards were chosen. After Brando put all these cards into his backup deck, he raised his head and watched the void around him gradually dissipate, as if a vortex was sucking in the cards that weren't chosen. To be honest, he felt that it was a pity, but it didn't help. Brando silently stared at the vortex for a moment, then with the magnanimity of a player, he threw the card book in his hand forward. The card book was instantly torn into countless pieces in the storm of energy, and then completely sucked into the center of the vortex with the scattered cards. It was as if in just a moment, it disappeared without a trace. In the next moment, even the vortex itself rapidly shrank into a black dot, and then disappeared. This is a step that young planeswalkers have to go through. You have to give up something to gain something. Tumen stood behind Brando watching him finish all this and comforted him, but congratulations on joining us and becoming a real planeswalker. Brando raised his head, and his heart also felt relieved. He couldn't help but take a deep breath. Since leaving Bragg's underground auction, after experiencing so many things, he had finally come to this step today. From being ignorant of planeswalkers to officially becoming one of them today. Looking back, he felt as if a lifetime had passed. Thank you, Lord Tumen. He stared at the distant mountains and replied softly. No need to thank me. Passing down the legacy of planeswalkers from generation to generation is a sacred duty. Including me, including you, we all have to fulfill this duty. Tumen replied seriously, although you have come to this step today as your guide, I am very gratified. But in fact, until now, I am still very worried about you. You should understand that your deck still has a flaw. Even if you have dual elemental pools, you can't support the consumption of so many planeswalker creatures. Tumen reminded him seriously, I hope you can consider this problem carefully. Brando looked at the elemental emperor who guided him into the world of planeswalkers and smiled slightly. I have already thought about it, Emperor. Have you thought about it? Brando nodded. Tumen was startled but then fell silent. With his experience and knowledge, he naturally sensed that Brando was not lying. Since he said that he had the ability to solve this problem, it meant that he must have the confidence to do so. This elemental emperor from the era of the War of the Holy Saints thought for a moment and replied, "Well then, since you have met my requirements, then I have come this time to give you a gift." A gift? Brando was startled. But before he could react, Tumen had already stretched out a finger and flicked a ball of light into his forehead. He widened his eyes slightly, as if pages of continuous movie-like images appeared in his mind. Finally, these images froze on a page. It was an old page with undulating lines and various diagrams drawn on it. Brando observed for a moment before realizing that it was a map. He could not help but frown and ask, "A map? Where is this map of?" "You will naturally understand in the future." Tumen smiled slightly and did not answer, "But I can tell you that this is a treasure map. As for what the treasure is, you will have to explore it yourself. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 698. Without waiting for Brando to continue asking, she suddenly waved her hand and said, "All right, I've done what I came here to do. Brando, I'm glad to see you officially join us as one of us. After this farewell, I'm afraid it will be difficult to see you again in the future. You can only rely on yourself for the future." Brando was stunned. It wasn't that he didn't know that the Elemental Emperor would eventually leave, but it was only when the Elemental Emperor said goodbye that he realized that he was facing a legend from thousands of years ago. "Lord Tumen? Hey, don't be shy. We're all men. Besides, with Saint Tassol teaching you, I believe you won't have too many problems." Tumen smiled slightly. "Although he's a little stubborn, he's one of my best students." Umph. The Wind Empress snorted heavily. But when she looked up at the translucent Tumen, she could not help but frown. "Old man, I have a question too." Tumen turned his head and asked with a smile, "Ask away, my student. After the Battle of Osopeo, did you die?" Saint Tassol hesitated for a moment before asking. There seemed to be a moment of silence on the platform. But Tumen finally spread out his hands. "I'm afraid it's difficult for me to answer this question. Because you know the history after the Battle of Osopeo better than I do. When I left this image, the late king should still be in Elka. That was before we marched into the Great Swamp." Saint Tassol frowned and looked at him. Brando muttered to himself, but in his mind, he was recalling the history of the conversation between the two. In the War of the Holy Saints, the four sages did not have an army to resist the Dark Dragon from the beginning. In fact, before marching into the Great Swamp, the Dark Dragon did not care about these lowly people from other races. Before the Battle of Osopeo, this tyrant and dictator of history had been staying in Elka near the Eternal Glacier. Even the players did not understand this part of history. For example, there was no record of what he was planning in the Eternal Frozen Glacier. Brando could only guess that Kelsey's whereabouts might be related to this matter based on what the dear Demonis had said about Odin once inviting Kelsey to join him in fighting against the mysterious enemy. Soon after, the Battle of Osopel broke out, and the Resistance army invaded Demia. The victory of this battle became a turning point in history. Since then, the Resistance forces began to grow stronger. The Bugas and the Dragons joined the war one after another. Not long after that, news of the Elemental Emperor Tumen's death spread. When he thought of this, he could not help but glance at Tumen. "The Bugas said they killed you, but some of the Silver Elves saw that you were only injured and fled, and not long after that you disappeared in the alfalfa fields." Saint Tassol continued, "In the end, we weren't able to confirm whether or not you were really dead. However, to boost morale, Fanzan announced that you were dead." After listening to Saint Tassol's words, Tumen could not help but laugh. "My student, does it really matter whether I'm dead or not? Besides, if you use the news of my death to boost morale with my temper, I would never hide and not show up. You know very well what I would do, so don't you already have an answer?" By the time the Elemental Emperor finished speaking, the lower half of his body had almost disappeared. He looked like a ghost floating in the air. The elven sister looked at him like this and could not help but clench her fists, replying silently, "I just wanted to confirm." "You have confirmed it," Tumen replied, his voice gradually fading. "Remember to say hello to Alanta for me. She will definitely cut your greeting in half." Saint Tassol watched Tumen's figure completely disappear, and after a long while, such a vicious sentence popped out of her mouth. Then she turned her head and looked at Brando, who was staring at her with his mouth agape, and could not help but vent her anger. "What are you looking at?" Brando hurriedly shrugged his shoulders. The grudges and disputes of the era of the War of the Holy Saints really had nothing to do with him, but presumably Tumen, as the teacher of Saint Tassol, Gretel, and Fanzan, must have had a hard time when these three sages fought with him. But when did the collapse of the Myrna people begin? Brando certainly knew of that era. The Myrna people at that time were as proud as the people of Cruz today. No, they were even more proud because the territory of their empire was once so vast that it included the entire Won today. Today's Cruz, Fanzan, Saint Tassol, and Atlanta were only a small part of the empire in that era. But even such a powerful empire eventually collapsed in an instant. And today the existence of the Myrna people could no longer be seen on the continent. Brando silently thought about these things, but he did not expect the Wind Empress to suddenly pat him and ask, "Speaking of which, what are you doing here?" The elf lady looked around suspiciously. "This place should be at the edge of the Black Forest. What are you doing in the wilderness alone? Is it just to see this old man?" Old man. She probably realized that the other party was dead, so her words seemed to be a little contradictory, so she changed her words halfway. "Of course not." Brando shook his head. Only then did he remember his purpose of coming here. But this matter was not easy to explain, so he could only answer ambiguously, "Of course I'm here to look for treasure. I met Lord Tumen, you saw it, it was just an accident." "Treasure hunt?" Saint Tassol stared at him suspiciously. "What treasure hunt? Let me see." As a former hero who had experienced the War of the Holy Saints, she instinctively smelled that Brando's words were not true. But unfortunately, although the Wind Empress was experienced and knowledgeable, she could not stump Brando. Brando took a few steps back as if he was silently counting his steps. He counted a few steps and then walked towards the mountain wall. Saint Tassol subconsciously thought that this guy was pretending to be mysterious. She narrowed her eyes, but she did not expect that in just a short moment, Brando pulled out something from the vines coiled around the mountain wall. "What is this?" The elf lady could not help but look at the thing in Brando's hand, and then she found that it was something like a slate. Brando just smiled mysteriously at the Wind Empress' question. "Of course this is something good." He kept her in suspense and answered. But this time he was not lying, because in another history, this slate was indeed something that changed Erwin's history. And this was the real reason why he asked Freya to come along. In another history this was the private property of the Valkyrie. And in this history, Brando naturally wanted to return it to its rightful owner. Tick-tock, tick-tock. In the large room, there seemed to be only the dull sound of a taut clock. This sound echoed in the empty room as if it was infinitely magnified. The shadow of the sun passed through the shade of the trees and fell in this study, leaving layers of shadows on the carpet, like a strange picture. A pair of snow-white feet wearing wooden clogs stepped on the carpet, occasionally ruining the artistic conception of the whole painting. Although Yura could not see, she seemed to have a natural ability to feel everything around her. She quietly walked around the room, occasionally turning back to look at her husband with a mysterious smile on her face. Those who were familiar with her knew that this future lord's wife had a special ability called foresight. Outsiders did not know how terrifying this lady overlord's ability was. But ever since she lived in this castle for 2 months, no one dared to look down on her authority. The young man sitting behind the desk, or the future lord of this territory, the night madman in Brando's eyes of course, was actually Eek. He held his chin with one hand and stared at his wife with a bored expression. In fact, ever since the Battle of Amberlight, the whole world seemed to have calmed down, and he began to feel out of place. The kind of life he was pursuing should be one where his blood boiled, and he would help the weak. But it was a pity that Erwin, or at least Erwin's southern border, was uncontrollably calming down with each passing day. The only news that was slightly exciting was that there was a war in the south that made Count Randner nervous day by day. Unfortunately, as long as Count Randner's brain was still functioning, he would probably not send an army into Anthony's territory. Moreover, after the Battle of Amberlight, Duke Anthony had strictly forbidden him from leaving. The young man could not help but sigh deeply and mumble, "My dear, you said that something would happen today, but we waited until now. It seems that your prophecy is wrong again." Yura was not annoyed by her husband's words. She turned to look at Eek and gave him a reassuring smile. Because she was wearing the traditional clothing of the nine-headed phoenix, her entire person was filled with a kind of elegant and intellectual beauty. Eek could not help but stare at her in a daze. He coughed lightly and asked, "By the way, are you feeling better?" "Much better. Thank you for your concern, my lord husband," Yura replied. I'm much better. My lord husband, please be patient. In the nine-headed phoenix, nourishing one's spirit is an important etiquette. But we've been waiting for hours. Just as Eek's voice trailed off, the door suddenly opened with a click. He was slightly startled and raised his head, only to see Makarov standing outside with an expressionless face. Lord Makarov, why are you here? He was surprised. Makarov interrupted him, Don't ask so much, Eek. Abe's received a letter and one of them is for you. Your Highness? Yura asked. Hi, it's Count Tonajul. Eek jumped up in excitement. Great, I knew he wouldn't forget about me. Hurry up and give me the letter, Lord Makarov. All right, what's written in the letter? He was still somewhat rational and stopped to ask about the contents of the letter. Makarov glanced at him and shook his head. This future Duke Anthony grew up in the wilderness. Even though he received some noble education, he was still a mercenary in his bones. His mind was filled with a messy night's thoughts. What gave him a headache was that he didn't understand how he managed to raise such an heir to the feudal lord. He pondered for a moment before replying calmly, The letter says that we should go to Fort Valenda? Fort Valenden? Isn't that Duke Viro's hometown? Wait, why are the Count and the others going to Viro's province? I gasped in surprise. Isn't Count Randner still at war? Makarov stared at him in silence. The young man seemed to have realized that he had said something wrong and coughed. That? The news about Count Randner was... Yura was the one who told me. I definitely did not go out. My lord husband. Yura could not help but sigh heavily. He was a little too decisive in betraying his teammate. Author's note, your 10,000-strong baboons are here again. What happened to the votes? Recommendations? Collections? Subscriptions? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 700. Half a month passed in the blink of an eye after the princess's messenger returned from Lantern Island with the news. The month of scrolls was an important month for the Bugas of the Silver City State. The White Tower rang its bell in this month, announcing the arrival of the month of knowledge and wisdom. Mages would publicly test their students in Gata or Nechidai's White Marble Square, causing the entire Silver City State to be shrouded in a tense yet orderly atmosphere. But for the people of Erwin far away in Tonajul, it was just a month that was getting hotter and hotter. The crops in the fields were beginning to lose their leaves, and the color of the Abyss territory seemed to have changed into a pleasing green. Even though the astrologers and scholars in places like Braggs and Ampere-Seal were debating whether the month of July was related to people's logical ability in the system of Wond, its supporters and opponents had different opinions, but in reality, it had nothing to do with the production and life of the majority of the people in this kingdom. People were just sticking to the rules of their lives at this time of the year. The sun rose and set, day after day, that was all. The tension between the princess and Count Randner was becoming more and more obvious. The upcoming war was gradually brought up to the table and became the hottest topic after dinner. Although the Count had remained silent on this matter, everyone knew that their lord was firmly on the side of Her Royal Highness. Everyone knew that the Count was a young man, and the princess's beauty had long been known throughout the kingdom, even in Cruz's generation. Therefore, in private, some people in the south of Mentale and even the Frata region were secretly speculating about the relationship between Brando and Princess Griffin. Of course, the most popular rumors among the people were nothing more than the knight and the princess, or the Count and his noble lover. In addition, the battle in Ampere-Seal was like the plot of a knight's novel. Brando did not know how the news of him leading a group of retainers to Ampere-Seal spread, but in short, most people would rather believe it to be true. As a result, the people around Her Royal Highness had been looking at him strangely for some time now. Griffin blushed slightly because the princess would occasionally mention these rumors, and reduced the number of times she met with him, which made Brando very depressed. Fortunately, the Roman did not seem to be jealous because of this. Instead, they listened to the bard's version of Brando's knight's deeds several times. Every time she heard the part where the Count met the princess at night, she could not help but be especially curious. My lord, the growth of the World Tree Fortress is better than expected. A month after you left the territory, we built the Moon Tower. And with the Moon Tower's magic, the transmission energy of the vortex of light increased to 10, 20, 30, 50 times a month. By the month of summer. Monica's crisp voice interrupted Brando's thoughts. He froze for a moment and looked up at the canopy above his head. Valhalla's development was even better than he had imagined. The enormous tree shade was more than 10 times larger than the last time he had left. The palm-sized leaves stacked together to form a shade that was like a piece of jade. When the sunlight passed through them, the edges of the leaves would be dyed a warm bright yellow. Brando sat on the stairs in front of the town hall and listened to Monica's boring report. The report itself was actually concise and detailed, but the Lady of Light's painful way of counting was really difficult to correct. Fortunately, after his ears had been ravaged for a while, Brando gradually got used to this natural way of counting. He could not help but sigh at the powerful adaptability of humans. He raised his head and looked at the moon-white steeple above the canopy. The slender body of the steeple passed through the dense layers of shade and was covered with creepers. Under the shade, there were wooden lattice windows at intervals, making the entire steeple look unique and natural. There was a moon-shaped resonant crystal at the top of the tower. The crystal was glowing, proving that it was now working. This was Valhalla's moon tower, and it was located at the other end of the square. Brendel retracted his gaze, and the square between the town hall and the moon tower was no longer a mere 100 meters in diameter like when he first saw it, but more than 3 times larger. And compared to the last time he saw it, there was an additional fountain in the middle of the square. The fountain did not have any traces of artificial carving. Instead, it seemed to have grown out from the trunk below, surrounded by mushrooms. There was a statue of a young girl in the middle. Brando recognized that it should be the symbol of the goddess of spring. According to Monica, this statue should be a bonus building of Valhalla, but its function was very real. The whole fountain was like a weak magic halo that could replenish the magic power of all creatures and machines within 100 meters of it. The magic halo's function was very weak, but it had another function that Brando valued very much. That was, if one meditated near the fountain, the effect would be doubled. This was a great news for training wizards. It meant that if an apprentice practiced spells near the fountain, they would only need half the time to master a new spell. In fact, the Shire had already discovered this benefit. Brando saw many apprentices wearing monochromatic robes casting spells such as Magic Ball and Fire Arrow in the square. Some of them even formed 2 groups to fight against each other. The scene in the center of the square was like a group of people setting off fireworks, which was very pleasing to the eye. But since last month, the Lord the Shire has already taken back the authority of the Moon Tower. So, the number of transitions of the light vortex has returned to its original level. Monica finally finished counting. She flapped her wings and floated in front of Brando. She continued, "My lord, according to your request, we have upgraded Valhalla to a 1st, 2nd, 3rd level territory. At the same time, we have also built the tree nest for defense. 1, 2, 3, 27 of them have already finished growing, and 1, 2, 3, 43 of them are still in the mature stage." She flew to the side and answered, "My lord, you can look over here." Brando moved the semi-transparent lord's interface in front of him away. The drowsy data on it gave him a headache. He looked up and saw that in the direction Monica was pointing at, there were some knob-like objects growing on the tree trunks that extended outwards from the square. There were also some aerial roots that were as thick as the trunk of an ancient tree coiled around these knob-like objects. Just as he looked in that direction, some light green words appeared on the roots coiled around the trunks. They were, Ancient Tree Root, Parasitic Plant, HP, 40, Intelligence, Willpower, Wisdom, Strength, 22, Agility, 20, Constitution, 25. These ancient tree roots were almost at the level of Iron Peak, but he did not know how strong they were in actual combat. Brando could not help but look to the other side. Not far away, Haruz was wearing a knight's training suit and fighting with a root, but his sword skills were a little too horrible to look at. The vines suddenly swept across the ground, and the shy and adorable little prince fell to the ground with a somersault. Brando looked at the boy holding his red forehead and climbing up with a face that looked like he was about to cry. He could not help but sigh helplessly. "As long as you defeat this root, you can rest, your highness." He interrupted Monica and shouted, "I understand, teacher." The little prince looked grateful, and then he was unexpectedly whipped to the side of the square's parapet. Brando held his forehead, and for the first time, he wondered if he had misjudged her. He sighed and said, "Go on, Monica." According to Monica, each tree nest could nurture 10 of these roots, and when 70 tree nests were completed, there would be 700 to 800 of these roots in the periphery of Valhalla. That was equivalent to 700 to 800 elite soldiers of Erwin's White Lion Legion, or the Black Blade Legion's Flintlock Regiment. And Brando knew that this was only a comparison of strength, not to mention that these roots under the command of the World Tree Fortress were many times more tacit than human soldiers in terms of tactical cooperation. My lord, after the World Tree Fortress was upgraded to level 2, a new defensive building was added to the outer walls of the square and the second layer of the ring below, the Elven Arrow Tower. Because we did not receive authorization, you have to personally decide whether to build it, Monica replied. When she answered, there were light spirits flying around behind her at every moment, and each of these light spirits would greet the patriarch that Brando had personally appointed. In Brando's eyes, these light spirits flying around the world tree were like countless fireflies, embellishing the huge tree crown with a magical color. Elven Arrow Tower? Brando asked. This sounds like a city defense facility invented by the Silver Elves. There are 3 rooms on the top floor of the Elven Arrow Tower that can accommodate archers, and each room has 8 holes that can face in all directions. There are 2 types of magic formations in the room, Frost and Flame, which can easily enchant the archer's arrows. There is an ammunition room on the bottom 3 floors of the Arrow Tower, and a ballista room on the first floor that can accommodate 2 elven ballistas. Am I right? He looked up and asked. My lord, you're amazing. Monica couldn't help but widen her eyes and exclaim in a shrill voice. That's about right, but there's something wrong. The Elven Arrow Tower of the Silver Elves is actually derived from the Holy Spire of the Light Elves, and Valhalla's Arrow Tower is the same, and there are slight differences with the Silver Elves, but they are still in a parallel relationship. The Light Spirit Girl replied with some pride. Can I see the data first? Brando asked. Of course, my lord. Monica flew to the town hall and pulled out a long drawing from it. Brando glanced at the densely drawn drawing and couldn't help but shake his head. In fact, he didn't need this at all because when Monica said of course, a light screen had already appeared in front of him. A 3-dimensional model of the Elven Arrow Tower appeared on the light screen, and all aspects of this thing were marked on it. First of all, there were 3 archer rooms that were almost the same as the Silver Elves' Arrow Tower, and the 8 holes and 2 magic formations were clearly visible. Below was the ammunition room, and the arrows and ballista ammunition could be sent to the rooms above through a transmission spell. However, the ballista room below was slightly different from the Silver Elves' Arrow Tower in Brando's memory. From the model, this Elven Arrow Tower could only accommodate 1 ballista, but in the marking of the room's personnel, there was an additional allocation of a magic apprentice. Enchanted ballista. Brando pretended to grab the drawing and immediately reacted. As expected of his lordship, Monica praised in surprise. What an ingenious design. Brando also praised. However, in his heart, it might not necessarily be that Valhalla's Elven Arrow Tower was better than the Silver Elves. The increase in lethality of an enchanted ballista compared to 2 normal ballista was actually limited, but the allocation of a magic apprentice for 1 ballista seemed a little more extravagant. He muttered to himself for a while, and then he understood a little why Valhalla's various settings seemed to exist for the purpose of cultivating a large number of wizards. Now it seemed that this territory was very likely to be the legendary territory of a true high-level wizard. This kind of territory was admittedly powerful, but the cost of cultivating it was obviously astonishing. The front defense of Valhalla's Elven Arrow Tower was basically the same as the Silver Elves, and the side defense was slightly weaker, but it had a certain degree of self-recovery ability. Overall, each had its own merits. However, compared to the ordinary human's arrow towers made of earth and stone, these high-level magic arrow towers were naturally not on the same level. Overall, Brando was still very satisfied. Once Valhalla had this kind of defensive facility, the entire territory's defense could be said to have increased by several times. Brando immediately decided and asked, "This kind of arrow tower needs the support of a magic pool, right?" Monica nodded, "But there is no need to be so wasteful. The magic pool converted by the magic pool is enough to maintain the operation of these arrow towers. 1 crystal pool is enough to support 40 elven arrow towers to maintain the operation. And according to the Lord's request before you left, the crystal pool has already been completed 3 months ago. Then how many arrow towers do you think we need, Monica? If we build them on the top floor's plaza, we currently only need 8 to cover the entire area. If we build them on the second floor, we need 20. If we were to build it on top of the root city, we would need at least 70 or more. Furthermore, if Sir Overlord chooses the last option, Sir Odin is currently building a wall there, so it will take a lot of time. The outer ring that Monica spoke of was actually the outer layer of the World Tree's trunk. After the World Tree had fully matured, it would form 3 regions. The central plaza with a diameter of 500 meters was the highest and most core area, and almost all the functional buildings surrounded this huge plaza. Below the plaza, about 30 meters down, was a 50-meter wide circular path. This circular path circled around the world tree. From top to bottom there were a total of 2 levels. The lower level led to the upper level, while the upper level led to the hollow inner hall of the world tree on the side of the wall. Below the 2 rings was an open region formed by countless Valhalla's roots. This region was undulating, roughly 2,000 to 3,000 meters in diameter. There were many flat spaces formed above, and there were roots as wide as great roads connecting them. This was precisely Valhalla's lower city area. However, there was no wall in the lower city. Instead, a descendant of a rune dwarf suddenly had the idea of building a man-made fortress in this area. This was the first time Brando had heard of this idea. He could not help but stand up and ask, "Odin plans to build another wall in the lower city? Wait, is he crazy? What if Valhalla expands further? Lord, after the core area of Valhalla reaches its current diameter, it will stabilize for a period of time. After all, the World Tree Fortress will not grow endlessly." Monica replied. What about the future? Brando still felt that it was a little unbelievable. The last time that guy said that he wanted to build an invincible city, without a gate, he felt that he should have noticed the problem. He did not expect Odin to be even more lawless this time. However, Monica clearly had a different opinion from him. "My lord, the World Tree Fortress is a magic territory. Perhaps you have not seen its magical aspects, but you don't have to worry. Even if it continues to expand in the future, it will not affect the old city at all. At most, you can just expand the lower city when the time comes." Really? Brando frowned at the mention of territory. Not to mention a territory of Valhalla's level, he had never even seen a popular magic territory of the players. In this aspect he was still a complete newbie. Of course, if every time Valhalla expands, the entire territory will be overturned and rebuilt. How can such a World Tree Fortress be called the strongest fortress from the previous era? Monica replied proudly. The strongest fortress? Brando keenly grasped this adjective. Initially he thought that the light spirit was just blowing her own trumpet, but to his surprise she nodded solemnly and said, "My lord, I'm sure you don't know the origin of this territory. Once you know why it was built, you'll understand that what Monica said is true." "What is its origin?" Brando narrowed his eyes and asked curiously. Monica was slightly stunned, then suddenly changed her expression and replied in a mechanical tone. "The Hall of Valhalla, the Palace of Gold, Asgard, the Utopia Avalon and Otteras, the first, second, third, fourth and fifth fortresses were originally replicas of Babel Fortress. After the Battle of Dusk they were used in succession, but as far as I know the Palace of Gold, Asgard, and the Utopia Avalon have been completely destroyed, and only one copy of Valhalla is left. Otteras is missing. But as a replica of the final battlefield, although it is only a copy, the remaining Valhalla is already a symbol of the greatest masterpiece of that era's civilization. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 701. Hearing Monica's mechanical tone, Brando was almost stunned. He could not help but blurt out, "Valhalla is a replica of Babel. Monica, do you know the legend of the era of the gods?" Monica came back to her senses and quickly shook her head. Her tone returned to normal. "No, my lord, I don't know." "Wait, then how do you know this?" "No, I don't know either, but ever since the World Tree Fortress was upgraded, as one of the people in charge of it, this knowledge seems to have automatically appeared in my mind." The light spirit girl hurriedly replied, "But I can't say anything more." Brando was slightly startled and calmed down. "In other words, Valhalla is very likely a creation from the era of the gods?" "I'm not sure about that, my lord." "Forget it, at least we know that it's ours, that's enough." Brando waved his hand and decided not to dwell on these messy questions. "Let's go back to the original topic. Since that's the case, I only plan to build elven arrow towers on the ring road. That's why I only need to build 20 arrow towers, Monica." "I understand, my lord. However, the territory now needs more magic power and resources. I'm afraid that what you gave us earlier is not enough." Monica replied respectfully, "Thanks to Sir Overlord, Valhalla grew very quickly." Brando clenched his teeth. It would have been better if Monica did not mention this, but once she did, he remembered the mountains of colorless and transparent crystals he saw under the World Tree. These things were an example of the wealth this World Tree Fortress had consumed in the past half a year. But this was only the beginning. On the list, each arrow tower required nearly 200,000 magic power, as well as a huge amount of resources. Magic power could be converted into crystals, but resources had to be transported from the territory one by one. He could not help but groan in his heart. From now on, the magic crystals produced by the Black Forest will double from 20%. In terms of resources, I will let Yuta and Amandina satisfy you first. Thank you so much, my lord. Light Spirit Monica flew around excitedly in the sky. It was obvious that she had said so much just for this sentence. However, Brando knew better than her how expensive it was to build a high-grade magic territory. The Elven Arrow Tower was just the beginning. With the Elven Arrow Towers, they would first need archers and ballistas, followed by wizards and magic apprentices. All of these required money. Brando rubbed his forehead and asked, "How's the wind archer training going, Monica?" "I was just about to stop here, Sir Lord." Monica immediately replied, "The construction of the Wind Archers Hall has already been completed. The first batch of soldiers to be trained are mainly tree elves from the Loop of Trade Winds. After that, we took in some elves from other places such as Wind Elf mercenaries and Wild Elf refugees from the north. However, from the third batch onwards, humans became the main source of soldiers. However, from the completion of the training, the elves are still the best potential wind archers. This wasn't out of Brando's expectations. There weren't many elves in the human world, let alone in a place like Tanajul. As for the fact that the elves were much more talented than humans, this was also reasonable. However, when he heard Monica say that there were 465 tree elf wind archers, 187 elven wind archers, and 160 human wind archers, he couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. He turned around and asked, "Why are there so few humans? Is it because the elimination rate is too high?" "This is also one of the reasons, my lord." At this moment, a voice interrupted. Brando heard this familiar voice and turned around. As expected, he saw Falerne walking over with a straight face. The wild elf girl came to his side with a few scrolls of parchment and replied, "However, the main reason is because of the strange rule that my lord set. Only girls can become wind archers. Most of the humans in Tanajul are refugees, and there are already very few females. Those who meet the requirements in terms of physique and age are even fewer. Coupled with the elimination rate, those who are left are naturally very rare." The wild elf sister glanced at her lord. Her current attire was very different from before. Ever since she became the White City Vanguard, her attire had changed from the original mercenary uniform to the more formal elementalist robes. However, the robes were still monochromatic due to the large drop in level. She then said, "Now, everyone in the territory already knows about my lord's special hobby. Although it is normal for a normal man to have such fantasies, Falerne also hopes that my lord can pay attention to your own reputation." "What?" Brando was stunned. "When did I set such a rule?" He suddenly thought of something and couldn't help but run to the tree wall to take a look. As expected, he saw a large group of elven and human archers training in the direction of the Wind Archers Hall. They were all women. Furthermore, all of them were women with high aptitude. He was almost dazzled by the sight. Brando hurriedly took a deep breath and turned around to ask, "What's going on?" He never dreamed that after not asking about the development of Valhalla for a few months, this damned World Tree Fortress had built a real army of women for him. Of course, it wasn't that this was bad. Brando certainly hoped that his subordinates could be more pleasing to the eye. However, as an army, men were indeed more convenient than women in many aspects. Monica hesitated for a moment before answering. The Wind Archers of Valhalla were originally inherited from the Silver Elf Princess Guards, so... Brando immediately shut up. He of course knew what the Silver Elf Princess Guards were. The name of the Princess Guards actually didn't mean that this army was the Silver Fairy Princess Guards. The name was actually a metaphor because every warrior in this army of archers was the most outstanding female Silver Elf. According to the setting of the Amber Sword, it could even be said that this army was the female Amazons in Won's history. After hearing Monica's words, he couldn't help but be slightly stunned. He probably never dreamed that he would inherit such an army. "The Princess Guards," he subconsciously asked, "does Valhalla's Wind Archers have the same combat power as the Princess Guards in history? That was an army of the same level as the Dragon King's cavalry?" "Of course not." Monica immediately dispelled his expectations. "The Wind Archers are after all only the first level of Valhalla's troop class. In terms of form, it can only be said to be a simplified version of the Princess Guards." "Then what ability does it have?" Brando asked. "My lord, you will know when you see it for yourself." In fact, Brando didn't need Monica's reminder. He was already looking in that direction. On the lower ring behind the Wind Archers Hall was a huge training ground. The first batch of Tree Elf Wind Archers were divided into several groups and fighting against each other. Brando immediately saw the figures of the female elves faintly discernible. In his knowledge, there was only one type of spell effect that had such characteristics. Invisibility? Yes, the wind archers are a typical field unit. Their greatest ability is that they can continuously go invisible for a short period of time during battle, or go invisible for a long period of time before battle. But now, the wind archers of Valhalla are equipped with the wind archer armor that my lord personally designed. In fact, they also have the ability to fly and glide for a short period of time. Almighty Martha! Brando could not help but feel a burst of joy when he heard this. It was easy to imagine how useful the wind archers who were proficient in invisibility were on the battlefield. One of the biggest weaknesses of the wind archers on the battlefield was their lack of close combat ability, and they were easily discovered. Generally speaking, once the wind archers' formation was approached by the cavalry, it would immediately collapse. But the wind archers were completely different. They did not even need protection. Once they were approached, they would immediately use the flying ability provided by the wind archer's cloak to open up a distance, and then use invisibility to hide themselves and wait for the next shot. Heavens! Brando could imagine how terrifying that would be. The only problem now was that there were too few of them, or else they would be of great use in this war. He suddenly thought of something and turned around to ask, "Falern, is there any news from Count Randner?" "Not this time, my lord." Falern maintained the same expression as she replied, "This time it's about a certain lord of Madara. Someone from Silverman's side who was indebted to my lord sent a messenger back with news. Just as my lord predicted, the undead army has begun to gather in Yusong." Bloodstaff. Brando closed the lord interface and stood up. "The undead army has begun to move, which means that Count Randner should be leaving soon. It's a little earlier than I expected. It seems that Duke Arek must have made some new progress that made him feel pressured." "Her Highness asked when you are leaving, my lord?" Falern replied. "Yes, my lord." "Her Highness." Brando paused for a moment. There was a sudden commotion at the side of the square. He looked up and saw the princess leading a group of people over from the Tower of the Moon. They must have entered the hall at the center of the World Tree and came to the square. The princess walked past the center of the square with a few maids. She glanced at her younger brother who was tightly bound by the roots of the ancient tree. It was only then that Brendel noticed that the little prince seemed to have completely succumbed to the tyrannical power of the tentacles. His little face was red from being strangled, his sword was bounced away and he was panting there. Princess Griffin could not help but frown when she saw this scene and shook her head. She walked up to Brando, took a deep breath and greeted him softly. "It's been a few days since we last met. Mr. Brando is still as energetic as ever." "Your Highness." Brando was a little embarrassed. After all, he had tortured someone else's younger brother, the future king of the kingdom, into such a state. It would be fine if the princess did not see it, but he did not expect her to see it. "I'm not here to talk about this, Count." The princess shook her head. "I'm here to say goodbye. By the way, I want to ask, when do you plan to leave for Viro?" "Goodbye?" Brando was startled. "I plan to go back to Frata first. Oberway and Anthony's envoys are still waiting for me there. In addition, Mr. Eek and his fiancée have sent news. They left for Fort Valendon yesterday. Duke Anthony has given him full authority to act on behalf of Anthony." She paused for a moment. "So I don't have much time left." Brando finally understood. He was silent. In fact, when he received news about the undead's movements from Falern, he knew that the time was ripe. But he did not expect the princess to come so soon. "Mr. Brando, are you going to leave for Frata with me?" The half-fairy princess paused and asked again. To be able to travel with the eldest princess, Brendel naturally couldn't wait. But he hesitated for a moment and finally shook his head. "No, there's no need. Your Highness, I have other things to do. You can go ahead and wait for me to meet you at Fort Valendon." Princess Griffin looked at him, and there was no surprise in her silver eyes. In fact, she already knew where Brando was going. She pondered for a moment. "Are you going to take those cruise people?" "Yes." Brando nodded. In a sense, going to the Stained Frost Forest was to help the cruise people, so of course he had to take these guys with him. But most of those cruise night were burdens. He thought for a moment and replied, "I just need to take Lorena and her fiancé. Veronica should be there to meet me." "Can you make it?" the princess asked. "I should be able to." Brando nodded. Although the Stained Frost Forest Labyrinth was a legendary dungeon, it wasn't actually that big. Besides, he didn't have to fight the monsters inside. The best scenario was that Arek had already gotten the heart of the dragon, and then he just had to snatch it from the hands of the cultists. There was no psychological burden. "Then I'll leave it to you." Princess Griffin looked at him, the meaning of trust in her eyes was very obvious. She whispered, "I'll leave Magadal to you. Don't worry, Your Highness. Princess Magadal is also my friend." "I understand, Mr. Brando. Then I'm relieved. But I have a presumptuous request, Your Highness," Brando suddenly said. He looked at the future Princess Regent of Erewhon and hesitated. To be honest, he wasn't sure if she would agree to his request. "Actually, there are two requests. First, I hope this time Freya will be the commander of Frada's army. Second, I hope this time Prince Haruz can go with me to the Stained Frost Forest." Once Brando said this, the surroundings immediately quieted down. The princess was silent for a moment. "I've already said the first request, Mr. Brando. The military command of both territories will be handed over to you. As for who will be their commander, it's also up to you to decide." As for the second request, the half-elf princess was silent for a moment. After all, that was her only brother. She gave all her hope that he could support the kingdom. Of course, she hoped that Haruz could be stronger, but this didn't mean that she could easily let her brother take risks. Although Brando didn't say it, she also knew the danger of the Stained Frost Forest. After all, it was still within the Erewhon kingdom. Most of the disasters in the Viro province came from the direction of the Falling Needle Hills. As the princess of a kingdom, it was impossible for her not to have heard of these rumors. "Can I know the reason?" Finally she asked softly. Brando hesitated for a moment. Of course, he couldn't say that he wanted to bring the little prince to clear dungeons and get some equipment to accumulate some experience. At the same time, it would be best if he could become more independent. He thought for a moment and finally replied, "I think Haruz, His Royal Highness, he needs a little training. Can't he do it somewhere else?" Griffin frowned. "Of course, but there's not much time left for us. Since there's this opportunity now, I think maybe we should let go and let him go on his own path," Brando replied seriously. He looked back at the little prince who was tied up tightly and asked, "His Royal Highness Prince Haruz, are you afraid?" The little prince was about to cry from being strangled, but he looked at his sister and then looked at this terrible teacher. In the end he could only say pitifully, I'm not afraid." Griffin looked at her brother and couldn't help but sigh. Of course, she understood that her brother was not willing. But because of this, she hardened her heart and nodded seriously. "I understand, Mr. Brando. I'll leave Haruz to you." Haruz looked at his sister with tears in his eyes. At that moment, the pitiful look made Brando wonder if he didn't take him from his sister, but was abandoned by the princess. But the princess was obviously more cold-hearted than Brando thought. She didn't even look at her brother and said to Brando, "Then I'll take my leave, Brando." Brando nodded, slightly moved. There was no doubt that for the current princess, Haruz was undoubtedly one of the most important people to her. She put the little prince in his hands, even more important than giving him the keystone. It could be said that if something happened to Haruz, her persistence and hope would be worthless. Brando turned around. "Pharaoh, go tell Miss Freya to get ready, we're ready to go," he ordered succinctly. P.S. At the last moment of the update, the backend of Chidien actually lagged. "I really want to die at the starting point, your strong baboons should go to hell. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidien. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 702. Northward of Castle Kirkle, the capital of the province of Grinwars, and into its confluence with Lantanailan and Viro, the town of Shallow Water had sat quietly on the western shore of Lake Valendon for centuries, ever since it was founded by Count Hadinger in the Year of Revelation. The coniferous forests of Grinwars that stretched to the north presented a completely different scene here. Large patches of cedar trees were scattered in the woodlands, and even though it was near summer, frost still fell from the treetops as the group passed through the forest road. The closer they got to Shallow Water Town, the more obvious the signs of the so-called late spring in the northern part of Viro became. The blazing hot summer was nowhere to be found here, and instead, the signs of the recovery of all things were slow to arrive in this area. The air in the forest was still wrapped in the chill of the end of winter, and the sky was so gray that it made one's chest feel stuffy, as if the mountain god of the sky, Ji, was stirring a layer of lime above the clouds. Brando sat on horseback and looked up. The forest was bare, and the thin branches between the tree trunks were like dense spiderwebs that stretched to the sky. The buds that sprouted in the new year were still covered with a thin layer of fluff, and a few withered leaves from the end of the previous year hung quietly under these buds. From afar, they looked like dry pupae that swayed slightly in the cold wind. But this was not the month of recovery, but the scene of the hot August in late summer. Such a spectacle made everyone in the group click their tongues in amazement. It was clearly the month of flowing fire, but this place looked like the transition between winter and spring. Philas rode at the front of the group and sighed, "Is this scenery caused by the so-called stained frost forest?" His loud voice echoed in the forest, startling a gray deer in the woods, which greatly displeased the guides in front of him. It was said that it was bad luck to annoy the holy spirits in the forest, and these nobles were all so ignorant and reckless. However, the local hunters wouldn't go as far as to argue with the nobles over such a trivial matter. Hence they managed to live in peace along the way. To Philas, the lucky knight from the Kurlutz Empire had finally gotten rid of his status as a prisoner, and the 10 days of prison life had bored him to death. However, he did not care about his previous experience and only treated it as a misunderstanding. This kind of open-minded personality won him the favor of everyone, because after he was released from the prison, he was treated as a guest of honor. On the other hand, Miss Delphian was much more stubborn. Even though she was not imprisoned in the water dungeon, Freya persuaded her, and perhaps because she did not want to make enemies everywhere, Amandina secretly locked the Prime Minister's daughter in the upper levels of the dungeon and separated her from the other prisoners. A week later she was taken away by Veronica's men. However, before she left, the lady did not feel the slightest bit of regret. Instead she scolded Brando. Brando really had nothing to say to such a stubborn lunatic. He could only leave it to Veronica to deal with it herself. If the Legion lady was smart enough, he felt that she should be sent back to her country as soon as possible. Philas looked around and suddenly pulled the reins to a stop. He turned back and asked, "Count, how far is it from here to the stained frost forest?" Lorena frowned and answered before Brando could, "It's still very far. I checked the map. It's at least a week's journey." "So far?" Philas exclaimed, "According to our itinerary, this is about the distance between the Flowerleaf Ridge and the Alfalfa Wilderness. Is it equivalent to saying that the changes in the four-leaf clover forest can affect Vahaina?" He first made a stifled analogy, then sighed, "If the climate can be changed at this distance, wouldn't the trees in the center of the stained frost forest be frozen into ice crystals?" "Pretty much," Brando replied. Although he had only been to the stained frost forest once, he was still very impressed with it. In addition, he had read a lot of relevant guides later, so he could be said to know it like the back of his hand. Although the stained frost forest labyrinth had a forest in its name, it was actually a glacier or an ice cave inside. There were more frost monsters than he had seen later in St. Tassol and Fanzan. "It's really scary," Philas couldn't help but shiver. "Are we going to just plunge into the ice and snow forest over there? Aren't we going to buy some warm clothes or something along the way?" "We already have, Mr. Philas," Medisha replied with a smile as she followed behind Brando on her unicorn. She also used her eyes to signal the only carriage in the middle of the group, which was piled full of supplies. The little prince, who had been sent to run back and forth beside the wagon, and with the hired local coachman, endeavored to keep it steady over the rutted road, and was heard to bray in a clear voice to the 4 thick-haired ponies, who paid no heed to him, but looked at him with a kind of contempt with their 8 eyes. Everyone couldn't help but feel a little amused and sympathetic at the same time. But fortunately, Haruz was starting to get used to it. He raised his head and wiped his sweat, his face flushed. He was wearing a brand new leather armor with a long sword strapped to his back. He looked like a young knight who had gone to a great noble house as an attendant, where was the image of the little prince in his brocade robe from before. "Oh, I remember now," Philas suddenly realized and nodded to himself. "Philas," Brando turned around at this time and asked, "Have you ever gone on a winter hunt in your hometown? I heard that the Barano area is one of the most well-developed areas in the Empire, and Pesa and Friar are both important commercial towns. There are very few such forests in the area your father rules, right?" The Count is so knowledgeable. Hearing someone mention his hometown to him, Philas suddenly had a better impression of the Count of Tanajal. Besides, Brando was right, he obviously knew a lot about geography and culture. He immediately opened his mouth. "Exactly, but it's not like I haven't participated in a winter hunt. There were a few times when my father and I were invited to Floral Leaf territory to participate in the winter hunt held by the Archduke of Floral Leaf. After all, the winter hunt is a very important event for nobles, both a tradition and an important social event. That's where I met Lorena." "I see." Brando saw the female knight blushing and knew that Philas was telling the truth. He also sighed inwardly. So they were childhood sweethearts. No wonder Philas could defeat so many challengers and win the beauty's heart. Plus, this guy's character was really not bad and he could be considered to have some personal charm at least compared to the children of the nobles, so it was no wonder Lorena chose him. He nodded on horseback and pretended to say inadvertently, "Actually, Mr. Filas can see our operation as a hunt, except that our opponents are more dangerous." "Really?" Filas seemed to be energized. "Now that the Count says so, I seem to be a little eager to try." "That's good," Brando smiled slightly. The Shire saw his lord smile and understood that someone was about to fall into a trap. He couldn't help but look at the young man with some sympathy. "I have a presumptuous request. If Mr. Filas doesn't mind, I'll leave the task of cleaning up the battlefield and organizing the spoils to you." Filas looked overjoyed. In the etiquette of the nobles, only the most distinguished guests had the right to be the first to touch and distribute the prey. He never dreamed that the legendary lord would think so highly of him. After all, it was unlikely that the other party was concerned about his identity, because just half a month ago, Brando had mercilessly imprisoned him and the daughter of the Prime Minister of the Empire. It was obvious that the name of the Cruz Empire was worthless in the eyes of the Count. However, it was precisely because of this contrast that he felt a little flattered and replied, "Since my lord is so fond of me, then I shall respectfully accept." For a moment, the young man was obviously a little confused by Brando's flattery, and even the way he addressed him had unknowingly changed. Lorena looked at her fiancé and couldn't help but shake her head, then looked up at Brando and said, "Thank you very much for thinking so highly of me, Count." "It's okay." Brando returned the gesture courteously on the surface, his expression calm and collected. In fact, he was laughing in his heart. He didn't bring the couple with him to meet up with Veronica or anything. In the final analysis, he took a fancy to the other's luck, which was as good as Martha's own son. Compared to the luckiest knight in Cruz's history, Pharaoh's lucky hand was probably nothing. Not to mention that the wild elf sister didn't seem to be very willing to help him with this matter now. He could almost imagine the days of wealth in the future. If Filas wasn't the eldest son of the Prince of the Cruz Empire, he would probably have thought of detaining the other party permanently. Of course, it wasn't as if he didn't have such thoughts now. And with the previous conversation between Brando and Filas, the atmosphere in the convoy suddenly became harmonious, and the conversation gradually became much more casual. But Brando still noticed an exception. He turned his head. The convoy moved along the main road with a clanking sound, and the shadows of people moving about. The afternoon sun dyed the whole forest a dreamy color as it passed through the branches. But among the crowd, Freya rode alone at the very edge of the convoy, as if in an independent world. She lowered her head, holding the slate in her hand and looking at it over and over. It was a weather-stained slate, its brownish-yellow surface covered with coarse grains, somewhat similar to the weathered granite on the Great Plains of Kramasu. A mysterious symbol was painted on the front and back of the slate with white paint. The paint itself looked like lime that faded easily, but wiping it by hand proved the opposite. Apart from this, Freya hadn't seen anything unusual on it in the past few days. She didn't know why Brando gave this slate to her, saying that it was something that belonged to her, and that one day she would discover the secrets on it and other inexplicable things like that. But all these days the slate was still a slate and hadn't changed at all. The girl couldn't help but frown slightly, but in her heart she wondered if this was another prank by Brando. He always seemed to like to make fun of her. But the girl from the countryside of Bucci hesitated again and again, and in the end she couldn't bear to throw away the slate. What if it was true? This was something that Brando had personally given to her, and for it, he had traveled so far, the two of them. Because of this, she held the stone a little awkwardly, and couldn't help but be lost in thought for a moment. She didn't even notice that someone had approached her. Brando gently touched the future Valkyrie's elbow from the side. "Freya? Whom?" The familiar voice made the girl turn around with a start and she asked in shock, "Boo Brando, what's wrong?" Brando frowned at the future Valkyrie, and of course her flustered attitude couldn't be hidden from anyone. "What are you thinking?" "I'm just trying to find out the secret of this stone. Brando, what exactly is this?" Freya's face was slightly red, and of course she was embarrassed to say that she had been thinking the wrong way before. But fortunately, the country girl still had some quick wit, and hurriedly held up the slate in her hand and asked doubtfully. Brando glanced at the slate in her hand. This slate was called a key in some occasions in the Amber Sword, but it was actually just a replica of the war slate. Most of these slates were passed down between the Myurnas or even older prehistoric civilizations, and were used to record the information of the real war slate. But there were also some records of ancient secrets and some records of the history, culture, and war before the War of the Holy Saints. Players had unearthed many such slate fragments in the past, and most of the background records about Tumen, the Dark Dragon, and the War of the Holy Saints were deciphered by players through such text. But the one he gave to Freya was particularly different. In the game, this slate had a deep relationship with Freya. In that turbulent history, the title of Valkyrie, which represented recognition and praise of Freya's strength, was not an honorific title given to the Valkyrie by the players of Erewhon, nor was it even a title given by the kingdom itself. But from Cruz to Saint Tassol, and even in Madara, even her enemies gave her this title. Of course, this was not just because of her personal charm. And most of the reason was because of Freya's Valkyrie mark. The mark on her forehead, which looked like a holy flame, would appear whenever the Valkyrie was in danger or when she tried her best, and it would be accompanied by a pair of huge light wings. In such a state, the power of the Valkyrie would often show a geometric increase. It was said that this sign first appeared during a competition in the Royal Knight Academy. This was also one of the main reasons why he insisted that Freya go to the Royal Knight Academy. And after that, the frequency of the Valkyrie mark appearing became higher and higher, and in those battles where thousands or even tens of thousands of people fought, it was obviously impossible to hide this secret. In the original history, Freya's power was first announced by players in the first battle against the North. After that, the title of Valkyrie followed her like a shadow. But other than that, more players began to search for the hidden secret. And the one who finally deciphered this secret was the player who discovered this slate. Brando could not even remember the player's ID, but he clearly remembered the whole incident from beginning to end. It should be not long after the Second War of the Black Roses. More and more copies of the war slate were widely discovered from all over the world, and players began to spontaneously decipher the content on the slate. At the same time, the history of the War of the Holy Saints became clearer and clearer in front of everyone. But from this slate that was discovered in Tonajal, the player who discovered it interpreted a completely different record. It was neither about the history of the War of the Holy Saints, nor was it a description of a certain war or a certain myth. Instead, it repeatedly mentioned the existence of the Valkyrie mark. And at the end of the slate, there was a vague mention about the way to activate the bloodline of the Valkyrie. The player who discovered this slate at first thought that it was a quest item to obtain a high-level bloodline, but after he tried all kinds of methods and still failed to obtain the next step of the quest, he finally thought of the Valkyrie of Erewhon. So he posted his experience and the contents of this slate on the forum. Not long after that, the slate was bought by others at a high price, and then it came to Freya. Brando remembered that it should be the silver year of the first era. Not long after that, the Valkyrie of Erewhon mastered the ability to freely enter the state of the Valkyrie. Until just before she died in battle. But seriously speaking, Brando himself did not know how to use this slate. He only knew the original location of this slate and some of its subsequent experiences from the news circulating on the internet. But at least he was sure that this was what it was, and it would definitely have an effect on Freya. He thought for a moment and asked, "Do you trust me, Freya?" Of course I trust you, Brando." Freya was slightly stunned, and then she seemed to understand what Brando meant. She looked at the slate in her hand and nodded helplessly. "I understand. I will keep it well. You don't have to think too much about it. Maybe at some point you will naturally discover its secret." Brando grabbed the reins and rode side by side with the Valkyrie. But since Freya was troubled, he could only comfort her. "Brando, you are becoming more and more like a Roman ant. You can just say that I am becoming more and more like a fraud. I can accept that." Brando replied helplessly. Freya glanced at him and smiled at him. "But it's good that you haven't changed at all since then. Sometimes I am afraid that you will no longer be Brando after you become a noble." The girl from Butchie turned her head and said quietly, "I haven't changed, but you have." Brando nodded. "You have become more mature." What? The Valkyrie blushed a little. "You wouldn't say such things in the past. You would most likely say, 'Brando, why have you become so strange?' Brando, you are too much." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 703. In fact, the convoy had spent the whole morning fighting the Lakeside Avenue on the west bank of Lake Valendon, which had been in disrepair for many years. This prosperous trade route about 30 years ago had become a mess after Oberg VII ascended to the throne. But it had been fine recently because they had lost track of the caravans. At least there were no bandits around. All in all, the convoy had been busy the whole morning. Everyone did not even have time to eat lunch. They only arrived at Shallow Water Town in the afternoon. At around 3 o'clock, Brando could see the outline of a town sitting by the lake through the reflection of the lake. It shone under the sun. That was Shallow Water Town. Shallow Water Town had a long history in Awen. Ever since Count Hadinger bought this land from the mountain people in the last century, the immigrants had started to settle down here permanently. At first, it was mainly provided as a place for adventurers to settle down in the Falling Needle Hills. Later, it gradually became a transportation route connecting Viro, Grimoires, and Lantern Island. Therefore, the town had maintained many historic inns for thousands of years. For example, Brando was familiar with Nissa's Butterfly Flower and Trout Pond. But in the game, Shallow Water Town's position was not important. One important reason was that it was the gateway to Lantern Island, and Lantern Island was rarely open to ordinary players. Secondly, the only high-level area nearby was the Falling Needle Hills. From this direction, one had to pass through the northern section of the Ansara Forest. The mountain path was very difficult, so players would rather go through Valendon than this direction. After all, players could still use the teleportation circle, so the distance was not too big of a problem. This situation continued until Veston's castle dungeon was opened. The 9 Phoenix Swords Golden Ice Flame appeared, and a large number of players flocked to this place. But the good times did not last long. Not long after that was the Third War of the Black Roses, and what happened after that was known to everyone. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but look up at the mountains. The Golden Sparrow Mountains and Ansara Sapphire Mountains intersected here. The 2 largest mountains in the east were their respective main peaks. Below the mountains was the Bachanier Pass, and north from there Veston's castle was hidden in the forest. The legendary Golden Ice Flame Holy Sword was hidden under the castle. That was one of Brando's targets, but he didn't plan to touch it for the time being. Speaking of which, there were so many advanced areas near the Falling Needle Hills. Who knew what the designer was thinking? He knew that a real adult dragon was guarding the Golden Ice Flame in Veston's castle. He didn't know what the relationship between the winter dragon named Katina and the one in the Falling Needle Hills was, but her strength was several orders of magnitude stronger than that of the young dragon. If Brando went to find trouble with her now, it was basically the same concept as courting death. Fortunately, Weiss Castle had been sealed for a long time, so no one would touch it for the time being. Brando looked in the direction of Shallow Water Town. This place was the front line of the resistance against Madara for a long time, and it left a deep impression on him. He and his senior sister's exploration team had once fought and bled here. Many places still retained fragments of memories of him fighting side by side with those familiar companions. They could see familiar scenes and locations in every street and alley they passed through, and they couldn't help but sigh with emotion. The carriage passed through the nearest road to Shallow Water Town and entered the town. As the nearby area was relatively peaceful, they were not interrogated. Shallow Water Town was under the jurisdiction of Duke Anthony. The Duke's rule was very strict. Even in such a remote place, it was rare to see a scene similar to Grimoires where the private army of the nobles was as fierce as bandits. Finally, the carriage stopped in the middle of the commercial area in the north of the town. Brando specifically chose an inn far away from the docks. The name of the inn was not outstanding. It was called the House of Carriages. In Erewhon and Wonde you could find similar inns with the same name. There was no connection between them. The only connection was probably that the owners were equally lazy when it came to naming things. This inn was also unknown in the game. Even Brando had never heard of it. But he chose this place for 2 reasons. First, to avoid the noise of the docks. Second, to avoid the familiar residents that reminded him of the past. Those fragmented memories that were like broken mirrors were like scars to him. Every time they were uncovered, it was like opening a scar. After arranging the carriage, they walked into the inn. The business of this inn, called the House of Carriages, was as quiet as Brando imagined. Even the owner of the inn probably did not expect to have a big customer. The bald, middle-aged man, who was immersed in wiping a plate with a dirty rag on the bar, was stunned for a moment when the light at the door dimmed slightly. He looked up and narrowed his eyes to see Brando walking into the inn first, followed by Faraz and the female knight, Lorena. Then Medisha and the Shire followed behind. Freya followed with a slate in her hand. Next to her was Hippamera in a linen robe. The priestess was bare-armed, but she did not seem to have any problem in such cold weather. He did not know if it was the blessing of the mountain spirit from Himalid that had taken effect, or if the life of an ascetic had made her accustomed to such harsh conditions. Last was Scarlet and the little prince who had just come out of the stable. Haruz, after a tiring morning, followed behind the mercenary girl dejectedly, like an abused child laborer. Brando did not bring too many people with him on this trip, because the place he was going to was too dangerous, and those who lacked strength would go in vain. So in addition to the necessary entourage, Brando only brought his own cards. In addition to these people, Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles, Babasha, her witches and Alaz, who were ready to meet them at the Falling Needle Hills, there were only a little more than 10 people in total. But there was an uninvited presence in this group. While the owner was still squinting at his group, Brando could not help but look back at the person who had been silently following behind the group. Until now she had not said a single word to him. She just followed him silently. But for the sake of the princess, he really could not take the initiative to ask her anything. After everyone had walked into the inn, the bald innkeeper seemed to finally react and confirmed that such a large group of people did not seem to be here to collect debts from him. He was stunned for a moment before asking, "Are you here to stay? Do you have any other services besides accommodation? Isn't this an inn?" Before Brando could speak, Philas asked somewhat incomprehensibly, "No, of course it is. Now welcome." The bald innkeeper jumped up as if the soles of his feet were on fire. "Do you need a room? There are still many empty rooms in my inn. I guarantee you will be satisfied." "It's not just rooms." Brando finally spoke, "There's also food. We just came from Kirkle, cold and hungry, do you understand? Yeah, the ground is cold and hard at night in this damn place. Tents and sleeping bags won't do. I can finally get a good night's sleep today, and there's food." Philas could not help but interject excitedly, "I want roasted venison, preferably roasted with charcoal from the alfalfa fields, roasted until it's oily and paired with spices, preferably spices from Luke. If not, I can accept Saint Tassol's herbs and salt. Then give me a jar of honey butter cake, baked herring, a cup of pure black tea from Rushta's House of Gold after dinner, and—" The knight from Cruz was talking excitedly, as if he had already drawn up a pie to appease his hunger. But Brando quickly interrupted him before he could say anything more outrageous, and said to the stunned bald innkeeper, "Listen to him, roasted venison. If you don't have it, the trout pond should have it for sale at this time of the year. You can buy it. Go out from here and turn left twice until you reach the end of the street. I'm sure you've heard of that place. As for the rest, just pretend you didn't hear it. But you can buy some seafood from Lake Valendon, for example, the mullet and salmon that are in season, and make us a few passable dishes. I can pay you double for those, and if you can get honey, I'll give you another reward. Also, the ladies will need some fruit wine to warm them up." Brando glanced at the young prince. "And a cup of goat's milk. I don't care what you do. Don't try anything funny with me. I know the rules here better than you do, got it?" The bald innkeeper shuddered slightly, and then realized that the man in front of him was an old hand, and seemed to know the town better than he did. He could not help but take another look at Brando. Brando's southern aristocratic attire was a little strange to him. Logically speaking, someone who could say something like that should not be a noble, but one of those mercenaries or adventurers who traveled all year round. But the bald innkeeper did not dare to be rash, and quickly excused himself, instructing the waiter to carry out Brando's request. Brando turned around and everyone looked at him with a little surprise. Whether it was Medisha, the Shire, Freya, Scarlet, or even Pahimera who had just joined the team, everyone more or less knew that this count was knowledgeable, and was a master swordsman. He had also dabbled in the secrets of wizards and elementalists, and even the secrets of witches. From astronomy and geography to the rumors of nobles, there seemed to be nothing he could not bring to the table. In private, Brando was even an alchemist, a blacksmith and a scholar. But even so, they still did not imagine that this count had such a side to him. This was not something that could be explained by being knowledgeable. At least in the eyes of others, this count acted like a seasoned mercenary or adventurer. This was especially so in Scarlet's opinion. She had only seen this aura from mercenaries who had traveled all over Erewhon and even Cruz. She could not help but stop and stare at her count in a daze. But the consequence of this was that the dejected little prince bumped into the package of the azure lance on her back and could not help but groan. Haru's painful groan seemed to break the silence. Brando coughed, as if only now realizing that his performance was a little too much. He could not help but glare at Philas angrily. If it were not for this guy who spoke without thinking, he would not have subconsciously shown his previous side in the game. But he sighed slightly in his heart. In fact, he knew that it was not all the other party's fault. He could not help but glance at the scenery outside through the window of the inn. The scenery here was a little too familiar to him. "As you know, I had an experience of studying abroad in my early years," he smiled awkwardly and replied. "During that time I had dealings with adventurers and mercenaries and also went out to sea." "I see." Philas suddenly realized, Count, you really had a bit of Lady Veronica's demeanor just now. As far as I know, the Legion commander's early experience was similar to yours. I heard that she had joined a mercenary group alone. The young knight from Cruz seemed to believe Brando's explanation without thinking at all, but that did not mean that everyone was as simple-minded as him. Brando more or less saw a trace of doubt in the other people's eyes. He knew in his heart that his explanation might not be able to convince everyone. The first obvious doubt was that he was too young. But now was obviously not the time to talk about this, and Brando could only brace himself and arrange for everyone to sit down. Fortunately, except for Lorena, Scarlet, Medicia, and Freya, all had a blind trust in him. Seeing that Brando did not say much, they did not want to ask more and took their seats in turn. But it was at this moment, when he thought he had successfully escaped the disaster, a cold voice interrupted. "Brando, you said you went out to sea?" Brando froze slightly. He looked up and saw the last female knight who sat down next to the little prince, Haruz. She seemed to be from the north, with a more common nose bridge, taller and straighter than a southerner with mountain ancestry. Her lips were a little thick, but it did not ruin the delicate beauty of her facial features. Instead, it showed a hint of sexiness. But this sexiness did not make Maynard appear charming. On the contrary, she looked at him calmly with her slightly purple eyes, like a she-wolf staring at her prey. She placed one hand on the sword and swept the black hair on her forehead behind her back. Brando also stared at her. This woman was the only uninvited guest in his team this time. At first, he thought that the princess was worried about the little prince and had ordered her to accompany and protect him. But he had tentatively asked Haruz to take on the more dangerous guard work in the convoy, and the other party did not seem to stop him. This made him very suspicious. Not to mention, with the princess's character, since she had expressed her complete trust in him, she would not be so indecisive. In fact, after a few days of probing, Brando was almost certain that the female knight seemed to be coming for him. But what exactly her goal was, he couldn't say for the time being. But just as Maynard opened her mouth, Brendel seemed to hear his heart skip a beat. "Here it comes," he thought to himself, then hesitated for a moment before replying, "What?" "I just want to ask where you came from?" Maynard replied quietly. Her tone seemed to have softened again. This made Brando slightly startled, because he did not hear the tit-for-tat in her tone. On the contrary, because of that familiar face, there was a touch of kindness. "What's the point of asking this?" "No." The female knight shook her head. "I'm just interested. Brando, can you answer me?" Brando suddenly felt very awkward. He did not know why Maynard suddenly did not call him Mr. Brando like the princess did, but called him by his name. This seemed to have suddenly shortened the distance between them, made him feel as if he was being stared at. But he looked at the serious expression on her face, and he really did not know where to start. Could he say no to his senior sister? Brando first shook his head in his heart. Obviously he could not. At this moment he suddenly realized where his uneasiness came from. At this moment, Maynard was too similar to the impression he had in his heart. "I used to study in the Karsuk Plateau under a Black Tower wizard, and I also had the identity of an apprentice. Later, I went out to sea with some people from today's Sebans to Saint Tassol and some places further east." He hesitated for a moment and carefully made up a story. Fortunately, he had rich experience. Even if it was a lie, he felt that there would be no problem. And in the other side of history, he had indeed been to these places. Even if she asked, he was confident that he could handle it. But he did not expect that the female knight just looked at him with a strange and regretful expression. She sighed and said, "I see. I thought you had been to the Shining Sea. Set off from Port Gris by ship, and a few days later, you can see the Kalanga mountain range piercing through the clouds shining on the surface of the sea. That kind of scene must be very beautiful." Hearing this sentence, Brando's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, it was as if he was frozen in place. At that moment, it was as if he could no longer hear anything. There was only one sentence echoing in his head: "Set off from Port Gris by boat, and in a few days, you will be able to see the Kalanga mountains that pierced through the clouds and sparkled on the surface of the sea. That kind of scene must be very beautiful, right?" "Yes, beautiful, majestic, and breathtaking. P.S. I'm not stuck today. I can't afford to play. Chidian is inhumane. It forced me to become a baboon who writes 20,000 chapters a day. Baboon the baboon, begging for monthly votes, begging for cute service in the book review section. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.